All right, so welcome to the Comic Book Historians podcast with Alex Rand and Jim Thompson. Today we have a very special guest, a comic book distributor, SteveGeppi, head of Diamond Comics Distribution. Steve, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Glad to be on with you guys. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.
Welcome, Steve.
Steve, we're gonna kind of jump throughout different stages of your life. You're a comic. You know, we have a comic book great series. You're in that series. And basically, we're going to start from your childhood and on. Jim's going to get started. Take it away, Jim.
Okay, so what I like to do, Steve, is to go to basically where you were born, who your parents are, and your earliest experiences with comics. So let's get started.
Is the standard joke that I was born in a hospital because I wanted to be near my mother? Actually, I was born in Baltimore. Back in 1950, yes, I'm a relic, and I grew up in a really famous neighborhood in Baltimore to this day called Little Italy, and
oh, sure,
it's still, you know, it's not quite what it used to be, so to speak, but there's all the Italian restaurants, and that was my origin, growing up in that neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
Did you go into D.C. very much, or did you stay just primarily in Baltimore?
I was pretty much my whole life in Baltimore. A big outing for me once in a blue moon as a teenager would to go to Ocean City, Maryland during the summer with the guys for, you know, a beach party. But I really didn't travel much. Was always, you know, pretty much a neighborhood kid.
I'm from Richmond, Virginia, so we were practically neighbors.
Kings Dominion, 2 hours away. I did it many times.
Yep, me too. Lots of times. All right, so 1950s, what were your parents, what were they?
My dad was formerly a full-time guy in the service in the Army, but later on in life he was driving a truck, you know, blue-collarish. My mom, prior to when she got married to my dad, she was a hairdresser. She used to, in fact, do all the hair for all the strippers on the block, the infamous block in Baltimore, the nightclubs. And it was funny because when I was a little boy, after she became a homemaker, I remember distinctly as a little boy in the kitchen, she had put two eye hooks in the door jamb and put a swing in there. So I would swing in and out from the backyard into the kitchen while she was cutting strippers' hairs. Little did I know.
Oh, that's great. And what about comics? When did you start reading them? Were you
my very first comic book? The very first comic book I probably ever had was when I was 5 years old. And it was a Batman comic. And ironically, that's kind of what got me back into it years later, because it was almost that very comic book that later, when I tell you the story of how I evolved, you'll know. But as a kid, I remember at 5 years old, you know, I would look at the pictures of the comics, and I wasn't reading yet, but it was like an incentive. I wanted to know what the hell they were saying. And so that was like an incentive for me to want to learn to read. And I remember telling people to this day about how you can even learn from an Archie comic. I remember learning it was Life with Archie, and it was a story, and the word spelunking came up. And I had to know what that was, and I learned out that spelunking was talking about cave exploration.
Yeah.
So even a simplistic comic like an Archie comic could teach you how, could improve your vocabulary.
That's
So
true.
that's what it was. I was an avid comic kid, you know, every time my mother would get home. And back in those days, you know, your mom brought home, quote unquote, a rack toy. Mom, what'd you bring me? What'd you bring me? And of course, everywhere she went, comics were everywhere. They were at grocery stores. They were at drugstores. So it was inadvertent, but she's always bringing me home a comic. So I got used to reading comics.
Yeah.
Now, did they ever get concerned about comics once the comic scare started to develop, or were they fine with it all along?
If they did, I wasn't aware of it. I just, you know, was so wrapped up, and I think my mom thought it was a great thing for me to be reading, but I would pacified. I'd sit there with a pile of comic books. The real good story about this is how I got kind of into back issues. You know, every kid would love seeing something they hadn't seen before. It didn't matter if it was a month old or 10 years old. It was an old comic. And I'll never forget that glorious day when one of my friends came in and said he found this little, ironically, liquor store just outside the neighborhood, in the Jewish neighborhood. We were known for the corned beef and the merchants there. And this little liquor store on the corner of Central Avenue and Lombard Street, the guy owned it, and his son had a fledgling magazine business. I won't go into what kind of magazines he was selling at the time, but he also had, it was 1959, I'm 9 years old, and he had this little cubbyhole boxes of comics that were a nickel a piece, old comics. But back in 1959, he was the first guy, that I knew where I could buy old comics,
Mm-hmm.
but he was the first guy that I knew charged more for older comics. So he had his quarter box, his 50-cent box, etc. And that was like the score of all scores. I would walk those 5 or 6 blocks up there every Saturday, rally around whatever I could do to scarf up $2, and come home at the time with 40 comics I had never read, prop up on the couch. My mother would make me a couple hamburgers. We had no air conditioning, so the fan was on, and I was in heaven.
Now, what were you reading by that point? By 9 or 10, were you going back and looking at EC Comics and Mad, or were you looking at Archie?
They probably went through my hands at that store, but I was primarily reading. I was very strict with the Superman family. I wanted Superman, Batman, Superboy, Jimmy Olsen, Lois Lane, and anything other than that was getting too exotic. The Flash, Green Lantern, when that was starting to come out. But I also I loved Harvey comics. I loved Archie comics. I loved Disney comics. So I had a pretty good diversification. So humor as a category, superheroes as another, and of course the infamous teenager, Archie was a part of what you fantasized with when you got the seasonal stories, whether whatever holiday or back to school or out of school. And I would sit there and just go into my own little dream world.
Mm-hmm.
And how long did you keep reading?
Well, I was reading regularly, but what happened, my life took a left turn. I graduated from St. Leo's School, which was the elementary school, took the entrance exam to Calvert Hall High School, which was where all my friends were going, and I was excited to go there. And I aced the test. I had like the highest mark anybody had on the test. So I was all excited, and that was kind of the day I found out I was poor, because I didn't realize, and maybe I should have on some level, that my mother couldn't afford the whopping $400 a year of tuition, because my mother had been, separated from my father pretty much my whole life. Went in and out, he'd be gone, he'd be back, he'd be gone, he'd be back.
Mm-hmm.
So I was devastated at the thought I couldn't go to that school, and they put a lot of pressure on me, and I reluctantly went to a public school for a whopping 3 months. I went to Mergenthaler Tech, which in Baltimore is known as Mervo. Very, very good vocational school, but academically it wasn't exactly rocket science. So it was in January, though, after I'd been there a few months, my freshman year, and my mother was really then going on welfare, food stamps, and I had to quit my job. I had to quit my school and go to work to support my mom. So I guess around that time, when my life went from a pubescent kid to a man supporting the family, comics kind of just drifted away. I didn't want them to. I didn't even realize it was happening. My life changed. I had to work.
Mm-hmm.
And what kind of jobs were you doing?
Well, I had a friend, his name was Lester White. Now, first I had worked at a lot of different jobs. I would get a job, whatever it was. I did so many different things. But if I left the job on Friday, it was only because I had a better job on Monday. So I never stopped working. But I worked at anything from was a famous place in Baltimore called Bethlehem Steel, was where everybody worked, at an area called Sparrows Point. They were one of the major steel industry players. And I literally worked there on 2 different occasions. Once as a contractor's employee, Hilgartner, Marble, and Granite, and then later for Bethlehem Steel. But I also worked at, the friend of mine, his name was Lester White, he hired me he was doing burglar alarms. He was a sole proprietor. And literally, we would go out and he would cold call a liquor store or whatever to put in what we call a signal mat. You come in, you walk into the liquor store or the flower store, whatever kind of store, and you step on the mat and it rings a chime to let them know if they're in the back that somebody's in the door. So we would actually physically make them. We'd get sheet metal and wire, and we'd put them together. But the problem was when we went out to sell, and we went all over the Baltimore, Washington area and in Virginia, if he didn't sell something, we had a problem. So literally there were days when we would go and we were on the fly, so to speak, and it would be lunchtime and we'd scrape together $3 and buy a jar of mustard, a couple hot dogs, and half a loaf of bread until he made a couple sales. But he paid me a whopping $50 a week cash. Keep in mind, this is like in the 60s.
Yeah.
And I took the greatest delight when I got my pay at the end of the week to give my mother 40 of the 50.
Mm-hmm.
She spent the rest of the week trying to spend it on me. But it was a great time in my life, and I felt so fulfilled being able to help my mother.
And then you went to work for the post office, is that right?
Yeah, September 6, 1969. I love that palindrome, 9669. I got a job as a letter carrier. I took the test. I was fortunate. I got the highest mark on the test, and I got the job in 2 months, which at the time I was told was unheard of. You really had to wait a long time to get the job. But I got it, and I became a letter carrier, and I did that from 9/6/69 till June 30th, 1974, so just shy of 5 full years.
But now, when you were 22, you came back upon Batman again, and that got you in thinking in a different way. Tell us about that.
Well, I was married at that point. I got married when I was 20. I had 2 children at that point already. It was actually kind of 1973, maybe. I'm not sure it was 72, but I had 2 children, so it had to be 73. And we were on vacation in Wildwood, New Jersey, which is a resort kind of like Ocean City, Maryland.
I used to live there.
And it was at that point that my nephew, my sister's boy, was reading a comic book on the beach. And I'll never forget, it was Batman and Batmite. It was a detective comic. And I'm looking over his shoulder, and I get this tremendous nostalgic flashback. And I guess it suddenly crystallized in my mind, like, why did I stop getting these? I loved these things. This was my passion. So I made a mental note that when I got back from vacation and I was on my job, every opportunity I got to talk to a patron, I didn't literally knock on their doors and bother them. But periodically, I would just, hey, you got any old comics, making small talk. And one day, I'll never forget, 5607 Liberty Heights Avenue, good old Mrs. Donatel. She had a son my age who was in college, where I should have been, but I had to go to work. And she showed me his collection. He had, like, I don't know, over 1,000 comics, all right in my wheelhouse, right around the period I would have been buying them. And I kept trying to buy them. And she wanted to sell them to me, but she didn't want to do it without her son's permission. It took her like 3 months. I'll never forget that glorious day when she gave me the green light. Yeah, he said it's okay. And I bought them. Now, you got to remember, at the time, I had no clue they were worth anything. It wasn't about value. It was strictly about nostalgia. So I loaded them up. I went home, and I was like a kid in the candy store going through all my memories. But shortly thereafter that, I discovered the Overstreet Comic Book Price Guide, which was in its 3rd edition in 1973. So for the first time, I was aware there was value. And then coupled with the fact that I was getting things that I already had, because I kept trying to get more comics, or I had duplicates, I thought, might be some way to offset my hobby here. So armed with that, I found out about these comic book conventions where you could actually go buy a table on a weekend and sell old comics. And I started doing that. And before I knew it, I was making more money on the weekend than at my job. The crazy part was I loved my job and I didn't want to quit. It was a good government job, had a wife, 2 kids, government benefits, vacation. But the problem was all the conventions, as they pretty much are today, were all on weekends. Now, if you work for the post office and you're the new kid in the block, you need to have about 237 years seniority to get off on the weekends. So I had this dilemma. I'm making more money on the weekends than my job. I love my job, but I can't go to the conventions. So I did the only logical thing a sane man with wife and 2 kids and a good government job would do. I quit. And opened an unprecedented comic book store in the basement of a TV repair shop, 612 and a half, mind you, Edmondson Avenue. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Exactly.
And that's where Alex takes over.
So this is an interesting thing, and I've noticed a couple of things. You mentioned the palindrome number. I've read that when you were 10, you would help neighbors with their tax returns. It seems like there's numbers. I've always been a numbers guy. That's been my thing. Numbers, and you think in numbers, and that's great. And I think that's clearly a skill, and that's what that makes you calculate everything you need to calculate. So that would mean that when you were buying and selling comics, the numbers, they were adding up, and you were probably always had in the back of your mind what price this one comic was. Even if you bought it 3 months ago, you probably remembered how much it was, right?
Absolutely. To this day, they tell story. We'll be in the warehouse, and this is like 40 years later. And it was funny. My son Josh was telling they tell the legendary story of Steve can pick up a comic book and tell if it's missing a page without opening it. And I was in my office one day playing around with a collection I just bought. And I don't even know he's paying attention, for that matter. I don't even know he knows the story.
Okay.
And I pick up the Spider-Man number 10, I believe, with the Enforcers. I was like, damn it, it's missing a page. He looked at me. What do you mean? I says, yeah, watch. I open it. Sure enough, there's the page come out. He goes running into my son's office. I just witnessed it. It's true. But I had that
the number,
the weight. I don't know what it was. I did it so many times over the years that you could, and I bet you I'm not the only person who could do that. It was just a a dreadful feeling you got after having, for the first time, discovered that was a possibility.
Yeah.
So then when it happened, you were almost sneakily or suspiciously holding your breath. Oh my God, please, please, it's a great issue. It's a great cover. It looks so beautiful. Please don't let it have a page missing.
It definitely shows how physically in tune you are with the comic itself, if you can almost read its page number like that, almost like Johnny Carson in a way. So then let's say now also during this time with the comic shop in the basement, you were also driving up and down the country, finding memorabilia, items to sell in your store. It seemed like you really kind of were realizing like sentimentality is a commodity. We can buy and sell that. And you really made the most out of that space in that basement, it sounds like.
Yeah, it was funny because when I opened the store, $100, tiny little place, I really had no expectations of making sales per se in the store. To me, it was a place I needed to have to get ready for the conventions, to bag the comics.
Yeah.
And the biggest hope I had at the time was that through advertising, somebody would ring my phone and bring me in a great collection, not that I could sell in the store, but that I could sell at the conventions.
Mm-hmm.
And I never forget, this is even going back before the store. I would finish in the morning. If you're a mailman in the morning, you have to file up your copy in chronological order of the way you walk the route. And if you got done a little early, you had some time to kill. So I would, and on my route at the time, the Antique Trader was like the Bible of the antique industry,
Mm-hmm.
big, thick publication. So I would have some time to kill, and I'd open and flip through. And then I suddenly see books, magazines, newspapers wanted. And I see ads in there for all the guys that I kept seeing at the convention that had all these great Golden Age comics. And I was like, damn it, now I know where they're getting them. So I started advertising in there. And I was in there for years. And what would happen then is after I opened the store, I'll never forget, the mail would come and I'd see a thick envelope. And I never forget, I would open it. And if I even got halfway through opening and I saw like a Golden Age book on it, I'm already dialing the phone because I knew speed of calling was snooze, you lose. And that was what led me to be driving up. Pennsylvania was one of the greatest states, still is, for finding old collections of everything.
Oh, cool.
And that was the thrill. I mean, getting up early in the morning, packing, your lunch or your breakfast or whatever, getting ready, and then driving up there with the thrill of the hunt, which after all, that's really the bottom line about life, isn't it? The thrill of the hunt.
Yeah, sure.
Having it's one thing, but getting it is even more fun.
Sure. Being on the prowl a bit and making it happen.
Yes, sir.
So then now there's, I've read that, in researching a bit, that like, let's say if you made a good hunk of money from one deal, you would almost think a little riskily a little bit with it, and then make an even bigger deal next. And then that kind of got you out of the basement into another location. Can you tell us like an example of a deal?
Sure.
And how deals like that then got you to a new location?
It's funny. In hindsight, I probably was crazy with a wife and 2 kids to make a bunch of money on a small, at the time, relative to the time. But if the next morning my phone rang and there was a collection that cost, and it was amazing how many times it happened that it was almost exactly what I had. Mm-hmm. Someone would want. I remember a couple of different occasions. May he rest in peace. There was a guy named Mark Feldman who owned the Maryland Funny Book shop. We actually had a couple stores there. One was called the Imagination Bookshop. He helped to run the Maryland Funny Book Convention. But Mark was quite an entrepreneur. He unfortunately died in his late 20s. He had some disease or sickness. Oh. But Mark, who was actually where I bought my second store, I bought his store in Silver Spring. But Mark was a guy that, he would always come up with stuff. So I'll never forget, the closest I came to what anybody would call a stake to start my business, because I really started it without a stake. I just had my, paycheck, or not even have a paycheck now. But when you leave the post office, you have a choice of, leaving your money in a retirement fund or taking a lump sum. And of course, I've only been there like less than 5 years. So I got a whopping $1,500. Yeah. That was like a big number at the time.
Yeah.
Lo and behold, good old Mark almost magically calls me up. And guess what the price was? $1,500. And he had the most beautiful, to this day, I've never seen better copies of 4-color 199, the Bullet Valley with Carl Barks and two or three. I still remember the people I sold them to. So that was a case of, I'd get a nice little nest egg, boom, sold. Another time I bought a collection and I made like $5,000 on this collection. Next day, somebody had a collection, $5,000.
Oh.
So I was always confident that I would roll the money. So it led to a philosophy that has really served me well even up until today.
Yeah.
Because call me the eternal optimist, but I would go to a convention like everybody else. We had all our expenses. We'd pack up the truck. And then I would say, oh, man, it's a slow convention. But the optimism would say, okay, it's a bad convention for selling. But you know what that means? It's got to be a great convention for buying.
Yeah.
So I would then go around the room, and the guy that was on Friday had the highest prices in the room, was desperate on Sunday and was needing to take some money home. So it was always, buying was always, to me, the biggest thrill, because you couldn't replace this stuff. You couldn't just call the factory and order back issues.
Yeah. Selling is good, but sometimes it's painful.
It is. Everything I've ever, we have a joke called the Geppi Lending Library. I sell them, but they're never really not mine anymore. They're only on loan.
Because it'll come back eventually. So now then your retail business grew from this. It sounds like numbers would almost line up, and you kind of went with some gut instinct, and then you were able to go to a new location. Then you had a second. Then by 1982, you basically had 4 locations. Is that correct?
Actually, 1980, because I had bought, as I mentioned before, Mark Feldman's little store that was in Silver Spring that I'm, moved it later to another location. Then I opened a third store in what is called Crystal City Underground in Virginia. And then in 1980, it was really unprecedented at the time. They were opening Harbor Place, which ironically today is 38 years old. It's hard to imagine. But at the time, it was the new festival marketplace. It was the second version of what had already started in Boston called Faneuil Hall. Yeah. Since then, there's been others, South Street, Seaport in New York. And I never forget when I took the bite to open a comic book store in a mall where rent was going to be crazy.
Yeah.
The night before, all the merchants were getting ready, excited about the opening day. And I'm sitting there thinking, I'm excited too, but am I really going to get the walk-by traffic to buy comic books? Well, the next day we opened, and you'd have thought we'd been open for 30 years. Just people. And that told me that the comics had the appeal that they always had if they were in front of people. And so that was the 4th store. And so in 82, when I was, I'm getting ahead of myself. So around that period, I was having other little retail stores opening up in the Baltimore, Washington area. And by that time, I had started carrying new comics, almost kicking and screaming because nobody wanted to buy comics, pay 2 months in advance, get a short discount, have to buy them in increments of 25 because they were drop shipped from the printer. It was not desirable. We needed them to keep people coming in on a regular basis every week. So other little stores started to open, and they would call me and say, Steve, I can't meet the minimums. I'm way on the other side of town. I'm not a threat to you. Would you mind if I add them onto your order? I said, sure, no big deal. I'll do it. So I had like 5 or 6 guys, and it started to become like a pain. But then my distributor, New Media Irjax, was the one supplying me. He'd get them into Rockville, Maryland, and drive them down, and et cetera. Well, what happened was he won a lawsuit against all the publishers that's pretty well known in the industry. And they were forced to break up what was considered a monopoly at the time for Phil Suling. And it wasn't so much that as it was the fact that he had the ability to drop ship. He could never even touch the books. He would say, Joe Blow's store needs 500 copies of this, 2 of that, 3 of that. And the printer would just literally drop ship them. So he would just take his cut and that would be it. And that put him in a handicap position because speed of delivery was important. So if the books had to go to Rockville first and then back out, they're already on their way to the store. So he would lose the battle of speed. So he won that. And when he did, he moved to Florida and he went out soliciting all the big sub-distributors and giving them a better deal. One of our friends, Bob Beerbaum, was one of them. This was called
Common Ground.
Common Ground. And so there was like a bunch of those. So then the time went on, and eventually I saw the writing on the wall that he was going to be in trouble, wasn't paying his bills, blah, blah, blah. And I applied to go direct to Marvel Comics. And it was after I got accepted direct, I had to sweat it out that for those 2 months he would stay afloat so I wouldn't lose my supply, him getting put on hold. And lo and behold, with 1 week to go, he got put on hold. And the publishers weren't in a position to release the books to me because technically he might yet still pay. So they needed his permission. So I was in Florida. I went to the first Marvel meeting that I was invited to. And while I was there, I visited his location. And that's when we cut a deal for me to take over.
Yeah, to take, and that's when you became sub-distributor to distributor, you're saying?
Yeah, he had a location in Largo, Florida He had some crazy name called. He had one called Fantastic Kingdom. He had one that he ran himself with his own employees in Cambridge called Solar Splice and Liquors. And then he had me as a sub-distributor in Baltimore.
Right.
He had Mike Ferrero, who owned Fat Jacks in Philadelphia. And then he had in Northeast Ohio News. So when I...
And you're talking about Hal Schuster, right?
Yes, Hal. And his father was Irwin and Jackie. Originally was Irjax, as in Irwin and Jackie. And then his other son, Hal, had New Media. They combined to become New Media Irjax. Exactly. And then when I did the deal with him, I suddenly had a location in Florida, one in Cambridge, my one I had in Baltimore. The Philadelphia, Mike Ferrero came aboard. And the only piece I really didn't get at that time was Northeast Ohio News, Neon. And that, ironically, sort of became the nucleus of Capital City Distribution, which became my biggest competitor for many years.
Now, before we get into the distribution, Jim, do you have any questions before we go to the next point?
Yeah, one thing we wanted to do, Steve, was because some of the listeners are going to be interested in your thoughts on what's happening now. So when we cover something, I'm going to kind of then apply it to a question that's about current comic industry, because I can't think of anybody that understands a lot of aspects of this industry any better than you do. So we want to hear from you on that. So we're talking about retail. And I guess the question I would have would be, and I'm sure you hear this a lot, who's going to survive in terms of your retail stores? Are the current owners going to make it, or are they just going to go out of business, and new people, when things get back to a different place, new people are going to open up new stores? And what is Diamond going to do to help these people get through this?
Well, I think none of us have a crystal ball to be able to say who is going to survive or not. There's been clear speculation, not just in the comic book industry, but everywhere in the world now, because everybody's affected by the pandemic, that there's going to be some shrinkage or some fallout. I'm encouraged by the fact that we're shipping soon and going to have comic book stores having comics on May 20th, which means we've had at that point, we'll have had maybe a 2-month drought. Yeah. And while that can be devastating to any business, in the industry we're in, it can be even more so if a store was already kind of on the ropes and hanging on by, thread. However, having said that, it's a very resilient type of retailer that we have out there. These are very young, energetic, not always young necessarily, but entrepreneurial people who are resourceful. And keep in mind, when I started, it was a different world, but we didn't carry new comics at all. So it was all about back issues.
Right.
Now, interestingly enough, today, a lot of stores, because space is so precious and so expensive, there are many comic stores that only carry new product because they don't have the room for it, or the rent's too high. But I think those that are savvy have been around a long time, and that doesn't mean that the new ones aren't. Some of them do it too. They've used stores, eBay, they've had online sales on Facebook, various other social media tools, curbside service. And I think when you try to speculate who's going to survive or not, it's kind of like, I'll give you an example. If you owned an insurance company and you use mortality tables to determine your insurance rates, an insurance company, through the history of mortality rates, probably knows within a few, percentage points, how many 35-year-olds are going to die next year.
Yes.
They don't know which ones, but they know
there's
a certain percentage. So they budget, this many are going to die, and we base our rates on that. Now, it's not a good analogy of what we're doing here, but it does say that there probably will be a fallout. Now, keep in mind, Diamond's goal is for there to be zero fallout. Mm-hmm. Now, it's kind of like the COVID pandemic. You worry about sometimes the people being said that they died of COVID-19 might have died of something else. Now, that may be the case of stores that don't survive. There may be some that were on the ropes or contemplating retirement, and they'll be lopped in as people who didn't make it. But keep in mind, every year we have a fallout and a growth. We have new stores, we have stores go away. Yeah. It's just a matter of time. And that it may have been in the case of somebody who's doing well, who just said, at this point in time, this may be the signal I need to go away. But what you hope is that whether it's a new entrepreneur opening a comic store for the first time or an existing retailer who sees the opportunity to expand, that the volume that we are used to having will get maintained somewhere, somehow. And it doesn't have to even necessarily be in brick and mortar. It could be a mail order service that gets it. The good thing about our product is it's evergreen because of the back issue market. I've used this the other night on the show I was on, where I said, if you're in the restaurant business, sad to say, and the last 2 months you weren't able to open, all those meals that got eaten at home instead of your restaurant, you're not going to recapture.
Right.
They've already eaten them. But if the comic books that you wanted that came out or should have came out 2 months ago, you might still pile them up in the box and want them. So we have a little bit of a built-in pent-up demand that helps us. Now, as far as what Diamond's doing to help, historically, Diamond has always been, even by default, and we don't, don't shirk that responsibility. We've kind of been, by default, the bank of the industry. And we feel comfortable about having actually the privilege of being the guys who, when a good account, for whatever reason, gets a little bit behind, we're happy to be able to try to help them and get through. That doesn't mean we're going to take an account who's notoriously not paying for not good reasons and just be, stupid about it. But we're going to continue to do that, and probably more than we have in the past. Keep in mind, our own cash flow's gotten murdered in this time. But we have great banking relationship with J.P. Morgan Chase, the biggest bank in the country. We've worked out a plan with the publishers so that we could make sure they all got paid, because while we weren't getting income, it affected our ability to pay. But I'll give you an example. Back in 1995, when we bought out Capital City, Capital had, through losing Marvel, DC, and a bunch of the other top-tier publishers, had shrunk down from a company that was 20 warehouses. We had 28, they had 20. We were all over the place with speed of delivery, and down to one warehouse in Sparta, Illinois. And they hung on valiantly, a fierce competitor, for a year trying to carve out a niche distribution. But when I guess things got a little worse, they were smart enough, to recognize that and called me, because we had a good relationship despite the competition, and said, Steve, would you interested? Now, some people said to me, Steve, you should just wait. They're going to go out of business and you're going to get it all free. That is not where my head was, because I knew if that would have happened, a lot of publishers wouldn't have got paid. And then it wouldn't have helped me, because I would have all the accounts, but that would have vendors going out of business. So it's kind of likewise today. You're sitting in a situation where we're trying to preserve as an industry. I mean, the parts may move around. This retailer has 2 stores now, he's got 5, one had none, he's got 1. But we're trying, and that's our goal as Diamond. How do we, in our unique position of being, the main distributor, it's a really ominous responsibility, but one I take happily, to try to caretake for that. It's tough, and we're not asking for accolades for it. We feel like we benefit a lot from it, so we should be willing to do the things that need to be done. Otherwise, we'd be being selfish, saying, okay, great for me, I get all the business, but when there's a problem, that's somebody else's. That's not the way it works.
Yeah, there's a
really
long
happy, and we're working on, we've got plans for the retailers, not only to help them financially. We're talking to the publishers that got a certain amount of returnability for them. We do a lot of programs that rely to point of sale purchasing, things that we provide. I remember when the comic industry was so infantile that we had to have a cash register program. Most stores, and mine was one included way back in the day, had a little box. We didn't even know what a cash register was. So things have gotten a lot more sophisticated today. Retailers are looking like retailers. They got point of sale systems, and they do a lot of things right. So we're doing our best to help them, and it's not limited to what we think they need. They know better than us what they need, and a lot of what they need is unique to them and not every retailer. So we're going to be there ready for them and do everything we can to get them through this.
That's awesome.
That's a great answer. That's what I was looking for. Alex, back to history.
Yeah, so distribution. So I want to give the audience just a little bit of background, just a little bit, because I was following you with what you were saying with Hal Schuster and those guys, and Beer Bomb's Common Distributors. I want to give a little background. So Phil Souling, he was said to have established, this is kind of what they say in the history books, the direct market in '72. There were some monopoly issues that led to the New Media Irjax lawsuit, which started in '78. And it was against the 4 publishers that you mentioned. It was Marvel, DC, Warren, and Archie Comics. Then eventually that kind of broke down, the monopoly, and there was some market share up for grabs. And New Media Irjax got some, and they were your distributor. Then also there was Big Rapids. Big Rapids, they actually from 70 to 80. They would distribute for some sub-distributors like Beer Bomb's Common Ground Distributors from 70 to 80. They went bankrupt. A couple of their employees then started Capital City, which you kind of pointed at already. And then, and that was in 1980, and they grabbed some of that distribution market share. And so now that kind of set up where it's like Capital City, and there's a couple other things, like by 1982, which is a big year, Bud he acquired A-Bar Distributions, right, in 1982. So the stage is being set, right, where kind of these three figures are going to kind of combine at some point. And so now that we have some background, first, did I get any of that wrong?
You've got it right. And there was a few others, actually. There was couple guys called the Donahoe brothers that were back up in that day. Yep. There was a lot of fledgling, by today's standards, they wouldn't have been considered the same thing because everything was so new. And when Marvel finally published public trade terms, that's kind of what opened it up for a lot of other potential distributors. So it wasn't just in a sense that Hal, Schuster, and Jackie and his father got their share. Mm-hmm. It literally meant, okay, you're going to be able to get dropship privileges, but if somebody else meets our minimum requirements and all our rules and all our requirements for distributing, we'll open them up too. And that's when they started opening a bunch of distributors.
Yeah, it just kind of opened the gates. And then it all just started to grow fast. And then Diamond Distribution, 1982 is this key year because then that's when officially Diamond Distribution starts. And it was called Diamond because there was a Marvel Comics imprint of non-returnable items that had a diamond on it. Mm-hmm. And that was your symbol. That was your symbol that to tell what you were. It was a symbol of your function as a distributor. Is that right?
That's correct. The story is kind of funny because I've always been a believer that whatever your company's name is, it should tell you what you do. You know, if you say Flower Boutique, but you're a comic book store, that would be very misleading, or just say Nostalgia Crypt, and nobody knows that means comics or whatever. And with due respect to those who have store names like that. But in my mind, and so I got to thinking, what do we do? Well, we distribute comics, but other people distribute comics. But what do we do that's different? Well, we distribute the Diamond comic, because at the time, to differentiate between returnable and not returnable, they sent copies to the newsstand that a newsstand retailer would purchase at a shorter discount, but have full returnability.
Yeah.
We would get a bigger discount, hence the retailer was buying them cheaper. But if our books got returned through the other system, they could make a profit just by returning them, because they'll say, I bought them from Diamond at 50 cents on the dollar, and I can return it to them at 60 cents on the dollar, make 10 cents for returning them. Obviously, the publishers need to have a way to do that. So they came up with that little Diamond slug. What they did is they ran whichever print run was bigger first, and then changed the plate and added that little slug. So I said, you know what? We're the Diamond Comic Distributors. Now, of course, 3 months later, they stopped doing that.
Right, exactly. But you kept it, and it's a nice name.
And we kept it, and it was always a good name, I thought. It was not unique in that a lot of companies, jewelers, we get calls to think we sell jewelry. When I was Geppi's Comic World, I got some people thought I was selling comedian supplies. So.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, there is an issue with that terminology. You're right, with comedians. And then basically during the 80s, it's just kind of an intense time of change, a lot of flux. And you basically had to keep your mind on all the numbers all the time and multitask all sorts of accounts mentally. So before that started, and the deal of buying or acquiring the New Media Irjax accounts, when you bought them out, because there were some, I read that first you gave them you were helping them out. You gave them some free comics to sell to help supplement, because they were overextended on what they were publishing, things like that. But then it came to a point where they really just couldn't do it anymore. And so then you had basically then bought their warehouses and their debt as well. Is that correct?
That's what they really got. Typically, we didn't buy anybody's stock. I don't mean physical stock. I mean like their shares. So we bought, as we've done with many acquisitions, selected assets and liabilities. And in their case, there was no real cash transaction, but what was happening for them, they were getting off the hook for all the debt, all the books that they had already received, everything that they needed that was going to be, they were going to be chased for personally, we, assumed. And then in addition to that, because Hal was going to go into publishing, and he put out a few little publications, comics, feature, and a variety of other things, that was going to be their niche and whatever else he was going to pursue. So it was a smooth transition. The accounts, what it did for me, and I use this example or analogy, I mentioned what happened in 1995, how people said, well, why don't you let the accounts go, you'll get them all, and why I did it then. It was a little bit similar, but at the time when new media was on hold, one argument was the same way. Why don't you just let them go out and you'll get the business? But there was other distributors. There was no guarantee I was going to get all of them.
Yeah.
So I likened it, as I said the other night on Dan Sheen's show, to a broken gate with a corral full of horses. If I bought the corral while the gate was broken and the horses were still in it, I could fix the gate and keep them.
Yeah.
That gate represented the 2-month lead time that the orders were in process. So these accounts technically didn't have a choice but to buy from me for those 2 months. They had a choice after that. They could turn their order form in, but I had 2 months to give them a chance to see what I could do.
Yeah.
And fortunately for me, we did a good job, I'd like to think, or otherwise we wouldn't have kept them. It's all account, none of them, all of them stayed.
You organized it, yeah. And then you also had to you had to figure out who were good clients, who were bad clients, and then talk to the creditors and be like, look, I'm going to organize this thing. There was quite an interesting movement there to kind of keep the order and keep that functioning while you're kind of putting together your company. It's really interesting stuff. It's fascinating.
Yeah, so what I did, and as a result of all of that, when I got direct, Marvel's terms, there was like you had to have a separate company to buy direct from Marvel. You couldn't be a retailer. And so I separated the companies on February 1st, 1982. And Geppi's Comic World, the proprietorship became Geppi's Comic World, Inc., and Diamond became Diamond Comics Distributors, Inc. Mm-hmm. And it was during that tenure where I was now, for the first time in my mind, really a distributor, not a retailer, sub-distributor who was doing it as a sideline to, as a favor or maybe even as to make a few bucks. Mm-hmm. So when I did that, I had to look at it like a real business. And I thought, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And it's just my nature. So we did everything we could to try to be as good a service as we could, competitive as we could. And I saw the opportunity to buy through or grow through acquisition. And over those years, we literally bought out a lot of distributors. Yeah. I always thought one of the reasons I was able to do that, and maybe this is just self-serving, but I had a good relationship with the other distributors. They might have competed with me, not like it when I got an account, but they were still friends. Yeah. And I still consider them friends. But if they got into a situation where maybe things were not so good, I always felt that they felt, it's hard for me to say, but evidently the history shows that it must have been the case. They were more comfortable calling me, telling them they had a problem and they wanted to sell, because I guess they felt they could trust me. Mm-hmm. And I was happy about that. And I would never betray them and say, okay, well, we didn't work this deal out, but now that you showed me all your numbers, sorry, buddy, I'm going to go pounce on your accounts. I just would never do that.
Right.
I never had to or never considered it.
Yeah, there's like goodwill. Because I've talked to other distributors like Beer Bomb and Bud Plant, and they say great things about you. So
one of my favorite letters I have is from Milton Greep, who's a dear friend of mine. Milton owned Capital City along with John Davis, and when our deal was all done and the payments were all made and everything was over and finished to the dot, Milton sent me, I still have it, one of the nicest letters telling me that everything I had ever heard about when you bought somebody out, you did it to the T and then some. So, it's a really good feeling, because when you compete with somebody, there's a natural negativity that interferes, but we always had respect for one another, and I highly respect Milton now. Look what he does now for the industry. He's one of the most knowledgeable guys we have in reporting what's going on. So that was a good feeling, and I'll never forget that letter.
So is the basic reason why a distributor would fail and be in the position in which they could be acquired is because they delivered too much product without getting paid by a retailer?
Well, it's a variety of things. Keep in mind, distributors work on the shortest margins of anybody. Mm-hmm. Now, today it's a little different. The margins are even shorter now, but back when it was strictly 20 distributors and everything was buy, sell, meaning the publishers would say, this is what you pay, and it's up to you what you want to charge to your customers, staggering, sliding scale discount. So in an effort to get more business, somebody said, well, I'll give you 55 off. And then somebody said, well, I'll give you 56 off. And then somebody goes, I give you 57. And they got working on such tight margins, it was almost financial suicide to think you could sustain that with such minimal margins. Mm-hmm. So that, coupled with the fact that you're buying non-return, So you might say, well, what risk do you have? Well, you have plenty of risk. First of all, if you ordered 10,000 of a comic book and you needed to have extras for reorders, so you bought 11,000 just to make up a number. Some of your accounts who ordered the 10 that are, so to speak, pre-sold, they might yet not be able to buy them, so you get stuck with them. Then if you order 1,000 extra and you don't sell 1,000 on reorder, they become your inventory, and you could get stuck with that. So it doesn't matter if you sell 1 million or something, but if you order 2 million, you're going to lose money.
That's it, yeah. So there's always assessing all the time. So
that's a couple with freight costs, the air freight wars to get books there faster. I like to think that, today, after having been the exclusive distributor for 25 years, if people really look at it, and I know everybody has their opinions on different levels, but the really good thing that came about, a lot of that money that was wasted on things like air freight are gone, because now you might not beat your competitor by getting the books a few hours early or a day early, but the protection you have, you're not late. So you trade off being early for not being late, and everybody gets their books on Wednesday. And that's a good thing. So there are a lot of good things that I could promote, maybe biasedly, self-servingly, but there is truth that there's a certain amount of value in consolidation.
Yeah, and the trains run on time, like you were saying.
Precisely.
So one more question, then Jim's going to go over another section. Is so did I read correctly that you had purchased Mile High Comics?
No, not the company. No.
Okay.
No, not at all. No, never. Chuck Rosansky is a good friend of mine. Chuck started Mile High Comics back in the 70s, and he's still a great customer of ours. But no, I have never purchased Mile High. I've purchased comics from the famous Mile High collection, which might be the confusion.
Okay,
not,
all right.
Not the company.
I'm glad I cleared it up, because I was like, what's going on? Yeah.
No.
All right, now Jim, go ahead.
Okay, so a couple of different things. Let's do another bringing it up to modern times. Listening to the part Alex was going over, it seems like one aspect of comics for you throughout your career is that someone else's failure or difficulties, and you want to help them, but it's also an opportunity for you to expand or to do something different or to move into a different area. And that's how business works. In the current situation, knowing that there's going to be changes in how everything works in this new order, can you think of businesses or aspects or new technologies that are going to emerge as new players or new winners? I think of like Walmart and what they're doing, or Comixology and that aspect of it, with online things. Are there things that are directly from the epidemic that we're probably going to see become more influential?
I don't think the basic function of, getting from A to B with a product is going to change. Now, grant you, we've had to evolve tremendously. We spent $10 million in our Olive Branch warehouse in Mississippi to put in a system that I call Dematic, that is the same thing that Amazon.com uses. So there's a inherent sophistication with conveyor belts and pre-stamped, pre-weighed boxes, so it takes a lot of the human element out of it. But as it relates to potentially new competition coming in and different sources of that, or even aside from competition, just let's take digital, for example. When digital first became something that was of a concern, a lot of people were in the print side of the world, which is the comic stores and the publishers and even the distributor. Oh my God, you would hear print, digital going to replace print. And I can honestly say, and I'm documented by this, that I never got rattled by that. I actually said, I think it's the opposite. I think that it's a good thing that they're spreading the word through digital. And I think it's going to help us create new customers that we might not otherwise get, because they're going to discover comics online, and they may not have found a comic store to discover them. It's not like in the 50s and the 40s where there was, I think, 150,000 different outlets you might have been able to find across the country, where, whether it be a grocery store, a drugstore, whatever, the comic books existed, so your mom tripped over them everywhere she went. Today, there are much better places to buy comics called comic book stores, but far fewer of them. Mm-hmm. So the children today, when I was 5, that was one of the first things I ever got brought home to me, so I was predisposed. But the kid today, not only is he not have that come home to him because it's not in front of his mom, he's got an iPad, he's got a million other things to take his attention away. So from our perspective, digital is a good example of a new innovation, something that's happening, and yet I look at it as a good thing. I think it's going to be bringing it, because I guess my belief is based strongly on the inherent belief that the comic books themselves are something that were meant for print, meaning that they're collectible. Nobody comes running up to an artist and says, sign my iPad.
Yeah.
They want you to sign their comic book.
True.
And they have value, not to put all the emphasis on their value, but it's another, remember the whole comic industry direct market started because of back issues. We didn't have new comics. They weren't available to us. They were on the newsstand, but we just opened stores because we knew there was a demand. And so that's something that the digital can't do. No one's going to have a digital Spider-Man #1 and feel like they got anything really special, because a billion people might have it. But if you got a 9.8 Spider-Man 1 or any grade Spider-Man 1, that's your baby, and then it's got value. So that's one example, digital. Today, you got Kickstarter as another way to create revenue for a publisher or a creator. And I don't begrudge them that. If they can go out and find a market that they know starting out would probably not work in the direct market starting out, it may be the feeder tube. Because, for example, if you have a comic that maybe you come to Diamond, and Diamond even says, I'll carry it, but Diamond puts it out there. It's in this monstrous catalog called previews. The retailer's got a limited budget. He sees the thing in there, but it's so buried in a sense that he can't really even sometimes notice it. So they get pathetic numbers.
Right.
Well, but he goes and does a Kickstarter and develops a following. It's kind of like a YouTube show. You get enough followers, eventually then you become commercial and monetized. So it's the same thing. I like the idea that there's experimentation. It was asked to me recently, I think it was on Kevin Smith's show or whatever, how do I feel about new competition? I said, well, I've always been competitive, and even though it might be argued that we have the most of the direct market, on our other sidelines, our merchandise and our other toys and things like that, and magazines, we're the little fish in the big pond. So we're used to competition. And quite frankly, when there were 20 distributors, we felt like we did pretty good, or we wouldn't end up where we were. But with that in mind, if there is new distribution out there and it helps make the market grow, I would rather have a lesser percentage of a much bigger market than 100% of a smaller market.
Right.
All right. So the other one, now we're kind of going to go back to a historical aspect of it, but one that I'm interested in very much, which is a function as a gatekeeper, or some would say a censor. But during your time, both as a retail owner and as a distributor, you've run into an occasional controversy where some people took exception to decisions that you made. I'm thinking of, I know Pacific Comics had a bit of a write-up about some things at one point. Gerber and Irjax Void Indigo graphic novel, and more recently, but not that recently, Alan Moore's Miracle Man 9 with the childbirth scene. Are those three good examples, or am I missing?
They're very good. In Omaha, the Cat Dancer, I remember.
Yes.
There were certain, at the time, basically, it was a two-way street in a way. Like, I felt I was definitely called a censor, and I guess by everybody's definition I was, because I was saying I'm not going to carry that. It didn't mean that remember, I wasn't Diamond Comic Distributors, the big chunk of the market. There was still availability through all the other distributors. But I understood it looked like, but my customers, they're being shut out of being able to buy this, that, or the other. And I learned from that. I was concerned because I was a little offended by the fact that I had no choice whatsoever. Miracle Man 9 was an example where there was a birthing scene, and I gave the illustration. Nobody cared about it, but I said, what if my daughter picks this up and there's this, I'm trying to teach her the birds and the bees and somebody's teaching them for me? Would I get a chance? I felt a little offended by that, but I got to expect every time that it wasn't my place to interfere. I could still do with my own stores if I wanted to, which at the time I had a few stores. And to tell you the truth, I don't think I even ended up doing that, but I also had other concerns at the time. And to tell you the truth, some of those are still true, because even if SteveGeppi doesn't care what he carries or how pornographic or whatever it is, when you try to take comics over the border into Canada or vice versa, we had issues. I couldn't hold up the flag and say, but it's my amendment, my First Amendment right. Well, I'm Canada, you're United States. I don't want to hear your argument. So I also felt there's part of my job, call it whatever you want to call it, was that I had a fiduciary responsibility also to protect the retailer. Now, a lot of people didn't want protection because they felt like I was being a censor. But at the same token, there were those who lauded it. I created a section in previews, which was a far cry from what previews is today. It was more like a stapled pack of pieces of paper, and it was called Cautionary Comics. So when I first dipped my toes into the, let's say, books I might not have carried before, I felt at least a little personal relief by saying, okay, I'm telling the retailer ahead of time, I've gotten to see the samples, and rather than me just have you call me up and say, you didn't tell me this had a birthing scene or whatever, we're going to list these under the auspices of Cautionary Comics, so you know ahead of time, be prepared what you might get. And it's kind of funny on that because it wasn't just about sexual content or things like that. It had to do with also what we felt about the professional level of the comic book. And I didn't feel like I had a responsibility, or I didn't feel like I would be doing the retailer right if two kids in college got a roll of toilet paper and drew two stick men and put a set of trade terms in and said, solicit this, and I say, no, I'm a censor. I feel like that's not fair. However, the funny stories about this is I had a drawer. I would get the samples, and next to my desk was a credenza. And when I'd get something that maybe I chose was just not really worth putting on the order form, but the retailer's going to thank me because this is too amateur, I'd throw it in that drawer. So years later, when Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles became a mega hit, I immediately ran to my drawer and I found a copy of a first print needed Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So, God forgive me for actually not being that bright about seeing the potential for that. But I guess at the time, it was so new and so fresh that it was like, I'm so used to looking at color Marvel comics with famous artists, and anything that looked less than that was probably in my amateur mind myself, or from a professional evaluation standpoint, probably not commercial.
Not going to work out.
I'll tell you this, though, 99.99% of one in that drawer probably would have never been, successful. But today, we don't have that approach. Today, we still have to be careful, I get the stick men on the toilet paper. But at the same token, today, we carry a lot. And then, what the irony of it is? Now we get the opposite. Why are you carrying all this crap? The previews is crowded enough. Marvel's got too many titles. DC's got too many titles. And now you're putting this in the preview. It's like you can't win. Mm-hmm. It's a tough job being a distributor.
Now, last question. I'm curious. Did you ever run into any problems or resistance, or get on the bad side of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund?
No. I was on the board for a period of time. I've never had a problem with the Comic Book Legal Defense. I'm a very big supporter of theirs.
I knew that, and I wondered if there was ever a conflict because of some of the stances you were taking. But
you got to remember, I think
they never had any issues.
Came later. It probably wasn't even in play at the time. I don't know the dates, but I'm pretty sure that was after that little period of time where I was, being cautious.
Right, and those 2 years of those comics
evolved since then. You wouldn't.
And
so I was personally on the board. Chris Powell is still on the board who works for me. So, and I'm a supporter of them. I stand by what they do.
That's great. Okay, Alex.
So back to the 80s, 1985. So now I had read you had hired a dollars and cents CPA guy, Chuck Parker, to help iron out some of the emotion out of some of the financial decisions, because you made relationships with people and you needed kind of like that cool, kind of cold kind of look at the numbers. Was that an important step for you to have someone like that around?
It was very important because going back to whatever, this is in the 80s, Chuck's been with me almost 35 years, I think now. Yeah. Pretty much the whole length of Diamond's tenure.
And he's still with you now?
It was funny because it started with my bank. Yeah, he's still with me now. It started with my bank, the bank then. And, I always used to say I had all the right numbers but the wrong product when I talked to a bank. They loved my balance sheet, but you saw what? Comic book? And then there was a little suspect, like a lot of mothers and fathers thought when they brought their kid in there, they were going into a drug shop. You can't be making money selling comics. You must have drugs here. So the banks, although I kind of proved my worth, I got my first $10,000 unsecured loan. That was like a score. And I paid it off early because of that. I wanted to make sure. I actually 1 or 2 times took a loan I didn't need just so I could pay it off and show them a history. But what happened was, as I started to grow, and this is still wee numbers compared to today, we did more in a week today that we did in a year then. But what would happen is the bank would start telling me, we want to work with you. We know what your needs are. We see the numbers. They're good. But you really need a controller in here. You need somebody who can understand. And prior to that, Chuck was working for a company called KAW, Katz, Bosch, and Windesheim, and they were friends. And so the bank told me I should, which meant you have to, in definition, hire somebody internally. Now, prior to that, Chuck had been working for KAW, my outside accountant. So he would literally come in, spend days dragging out of my boxes and my paperwork to create the numbers that ordinarily we were supposed to be giving them to do.
Oh, okay.
You had to literally go get them and then do them.
Uh-huh.
So we went around, started interviewing, and Chuck was at every interview. And I was one of those guys that comfortability was important. And I thought to myself, every time we'd interview somebody, I'd be looking over at Chuck and saying, I think I should hire him, not those guys. So one day I went over to Steve Gershman, who was one of Chuck's bosses, and said, Steve, I said, I don't want to offend you, and I would never do things behind your back, but you've been showing me all these, candidates. I really like to hire Chuck. Would you be upset if I hired Chuck?
Yeah.
He said, well, it would hurt us. He said, but, we'd be flattered that that's the nature of our business. People move on. So I made and I think Chuck kind of expected it. I might have been sending body language signals. I don't know. He could tell you. And then I hired Chuck, and it was probably one of the best moves I ever made.
Oh, that's awesome.
Because it freed me up from having to be doing everything. And I had the comfort of knowing I had somebody that really not only understood, but cared a lot. And it really led to a lot of other great employees, not the least of which of Larry Swanson's our CFO. These were guys I think they hate me at KAW because I think I hired like 6 people out of that company. But that was really important. That was one of the most important things that happened.
No, that's awesome. I wanted that. Thanks for giving me some background on Chuck. That's cool. And that's cool that he's still with you now.
Absolutely.
So now 1987. So interesting year for you and Diamond. So Diamond made around 19 million in sales, went national in 1988 with the purchase of the West Coast Bud Plants business, who had also acquired on the way there between 82 and 88 Pacific Distribution, as well as Nanette Rosansky's Alternate Realities Distributors. And so basically with that buyout, it looks like around that time he was interested in kind of selling, because he sold Comics and Comics a year after that. Basically with that buyout, you had control of about 40% of the direct market. So how did that, did he just kind of, did you call him or did he call you? How did that happen?
It's a great story. I told you before, I always kind of had a good relationship with the, competitors and friends, where we would be comfortable. This is a great story because at the time, First Comics, Rick Obadiah, may he rest in peace, started First Comics. And Rick was suing Marvel, and he was also suing World Color Press at Sparta, Illinois, for price discrimination. And they called me, Bud Plant, and Gary Colabono, a retailer in Chicago, another dear friend, in to court as witnesses for First Comics. It was an awkward position because I didn't want to be an enemy of World Color Press or Marvel, but I was, in effect, subpoenaed. I think it was actually a subpoena. Bottom line is, I forget the guy's first name. His last name was Cherry. He was a hotshot attorney, really fast-moving, aggressive. So I never forget, they put me on the stand. I was on the stand all day long, grilling me, the lawyers for World Color Press, back and forth. And I was just being honest. And at the end of and this sounds a little self-serving, but at the end of the day, Cherry came over to Gary, me, and Bud and said, Steve did such a good job today. I'm not going to need you guys. So he sent, Gary couldn't go. He had to go home. He lived in Chicago. Me and Bud lived on the coasts. So he sent me and Bud to dinner at Nick's Fish House, I think it was called, or Nick's Steakhouse in Chicago. I don't know if it's still there, but it was one of the greatest meals I ever had. And so Cherry must have called the maitre d', and we were like kings. I think we didn't even see a menu for the first hour. We had everything being brought to us like kings. But awesome. What was significant about that, because it was an hour before we even saw a menu, we had a 3.5-hour dinner. And it was during that dinner that I started to talk more seriously to Bud about the possibility of selling his company. You have to understand that up to that point, my distribution scope had been from the Midwest, call it Chicago, Sparta / St. Louis, Dallas, east. He represented all new territory for me, the West. He had 7 locations as a result of the acquisitions you mentioned. And keep in mind, when Bud used to advertise before he got into comics, his ad slogan was "But No Comics." He would have art books and everything but no comic. So Bud kind of went into this, and he'll tell you this, kicking and screaming. He never, I don't think, really wanted to be a comic book distributor like we define it today. So during that dinner, we formed the kind of the semi-handshake version of it. And before I knew it, we were signing a deal July 16th, 1988. We purchased Bud Plant Inc., who was the 3rd largest distributor. Diamond was the 2nd largest distributor. And by virtue of that acquisition, we overnight became the largest distributor, hence the world's largest distributor of English language comics, which gave us, as you mentioned, collectively about a 44% market share overall. And that purchase, you mentioned we did $19 million in 1987, which I think is an accurate number. And it was overnight on paper, much let alone reality, a 60% increase in our size, which is a big thing for any company to take a company and have 60% growth overnight. And it actually ended up being more because the industry was growing. But we swallowed it. And those 7 warehouses, never forget, Chuck Parker went with me. We flew to 7 cities in 7 days. We met with all the employees at each location. We called in every retailer at every location. Wow. And I never was so worn out from meetings in my life. But in 7 days, we managed to make our pitch, and we got the opportunity. And as I say, the rest is history.
Yeah, that's interesting, because there's one thing signing the page, but there's the other thing of incorporation and physically
actually doing it,
and making it, coordinating everybody. That's pretty stressful.
We had a lot of experience with the other, having bought out a bunch of smaller distributors, but it was still challenging, and it was a very, very big ask to do. But we got great cooperation from, keep in mind, you're working for these other companies, and for all intents and purposes, even though they were on the West Coast, Diamond's quote unquote a competitor. And now all of a sudden you're going to be working for the competition. But I think meeting with those employees was a big factor. They got to see me in person, got to talk to them personally, reassuring them honestly from my heart what my intentions were. They gave me a chance, and it worked out. So I'm very blessed to have had that opportunity. But it was scary, and I'll give Chuck Parker a lot of credit there, because once I did the signing, him and the other people at my company took over the heavy lifting, and not the physical side of it of shipping books, but the behind the scenes, doing the contract, getting it ready, negotiating, and making it happen. So that was another significant part they played.
That's awesome. Now Bud was also distributing underground comics, which you hadn't distributed those before that, right?
I had not, no.
And
I'm trying to remember the transition. We took the position, though, we were not going to take away from anything that Bud was doing and make it be less than what they had. So I don't remember the details, but if Bud was carrying something and we weren't, we were now carrying it.
So you incorporated that part of the distribution too, then?
Yeah, and it was interesting because that's kind of your birth of previews, because we had been putting together a stapled together package of pages with one-line listings for whatever we were soliciting. And I'll never forget the day when some of the guys moved east to come to work for me that worked for Bud Plant, not the least of which is Mr. Previews, Marty Grosser, who's still doing it. But it was a guy named Steve Bond, and I'll never forget the day how proudly he walked into my office there and handed me my first copy of what was a much smaller version of Previews. And I was so proud. I had such a primitive-looking order form compared to Capital City, who had advanced comics and looked much better than ours, quite frankly. But now, look at this. I've got a catalog that looks like a catalog, because we didn't have those capabilities. Despite the size we had been doing it more on a shoestring in a sense. So that was a fun time.
So you picked up new tricks with each acquisition.
Well, the goal was to take the sum of the parts and make them greater than the total. And so we, through a Bud Plant acquisition, became better on the graphic side with the order form.
That's cool.
And one of the most valuable things I've always felt that I got in an acquisition was the human resources. We weren't just buying volume and, geography. We were getting people that were loyal to Bud for many, many years that had proven themselves in the industry. And some of those people are still with us today. So that's valuable. And I couldn't have done it without them, to tell you the truth.
Right. Okay, so then now due to the volume of product delivery, you had mentioned it that you and Capital at this point now were able to have better deals with Marvel and DC because you had more efficient freight systems with handling high volume. And then by basically having high volume, you have less of a margin, but you could actually still make a good profit because there was so much stuff being transported. Is that right?
Yeah, we never got a better deal from the publisher per se, because the discounts were the discounts, and it was still buy-sell at that time. We'd buy 60% off and sell on a sliding scale upwards of 55, 56, 57%. But in the course of that, where we would benefit was the combined volume gave us the economies of scale because a certain amount of the overhead was fixed. Buzz was a little different because we're picking up 7 new locations, but there was still a certain portion of that economy of scale that inured to us that made us be able to work, albeit on the same or lesser margins over the years, with the increases of cover price, with the increases of the amount of copies we were selling. We could allocate the costs of customer service and whatever other add-on services we do across the board. So instead of having 500 accounts to allocate that heavy cost, that fixed cost, we could now have 1,000 or whatever as it grew to.
So then last one, then Jim will go to the next section, is in 1990, you acquire selected assets of Seattle-based distributor Destiny Distribution and took over the operations of Oregon's Second Genesis, right? Is that correct?
Sir. Richard Finn, yes. I never forget that deal because I had flown in to meet Phil Pankow, who owned Destiny, and I'd done a deal. I was done. I had to fly to Los Angeles. I'm in Los Angeles, happy about the deal. I get a phone call from Phil.
Yeah.
He had gotten apparently a call from Milton, and now he was telling me I've been topped. The deal was off the table. So I had to fly back up there, kept him up till 4 a.m, I think, and I finally convinced him to come back and salvage the deal. So that was one that almost got away.
That's interesting. So then did that basically just solidify full control of the West Coast at that point?
Well, what it did for us, certainly the Bud Plant deal meant for the first time we were a coast-to-coast distributor.
Yeah.
We weren't just middle country east. We weren't defined by a region. We were coast to coast. And in addition to that, Bud had a lot of accounts because of what he initially started with as Bud Plant's catalog for retail. Bud had a lot of accounts internationally, and we didn't really have a lot of that. And Bud was kind of a good start for us internationally because he was already servicing those accounts, and because we had a broader product line that encouraged some of those foreign accounts to become bigger and more important accounts, and that evolved pretty good too.
Did Capital have any West Coast at the time?
Yes, they did. They bought, I think, Bob Common Ground, I think, was
they did.
Time
they bought because they bought.
I'm not forgetting which came first, the chicken or the egg. I'm not sure. I bought Bud first, and then they bought. Bob could tell you that what came first.
Well,
but Capital did.
He bought. I think Capital bought Bob's Common Ground sub-distributors in 1982, and then
so he was already on the West Coast.
This was already done. Yeah, so I guess they still had that. Okay, I see. What you're saying.
You said, I guess that's part of what was going on at the time, because I had my biggest competitor had a presence on the West Coast. We really weren't in a position to compete because speed of delivery was so important. It would be impractical, unless we air freighted them out of Sparta, and that was totally waste of money.
Yeah.
So that was our foothold, so to speak, to get in the West Coast.
I gotcha. All right, Jim.
So having covered the whole United States at this point, in 1991, you set up Diamond UK Limited as well and begin operations in the UK, correct?
Actually, it was 1993 that we formed Diamond UK. Prior to that, we had a sub-distributor called Neptune Distributors that was competing with Titan. And again, I was friends with Mike Lake and Nick Landau and guys who owned Titan Distributors, and I had always been trying to get them to sell it to me. And I think when Neptune got in trouble and owed us a lot of money, I had two choices. I could either suck it up and take the hit and lose the money, or I could come over there and pick up the pieces and resurrect it under the auspices of Diamond UK. And I think that, in a way, only Mike or Nick would be able to say for sure, might have brought them to the table a little bit more, because maybe at the time they might have been thinking, certainly I would have if I was them, well, Neptune goes away, that's going to be great. They've been a pain in our butt for a while having another distributor over here, and when they go out, we'll get those accounts back. But when I went over, I guess because I had an interest in doing UK, and I already had a lot of money tied up in this account that owed me money, my best version of that would be to go over, cut a deal, take over. And I'll never forget, I stayed at the Langham Hilton, which is a very nice hotel in London. I was in that hotel 30 days, never left the building. I had every concierge, every butler, that knew me by name. Because they would just, those days it wasn't social media. They keep bringing me pink slips up of messages. And I literally talked to every account in the United Kingdom over that period of time. But it was in 1993
now, was there,
that we actually, and ironically, I think it's the same date as a Bud Planet. It was July 16th or somewhere very close.
Oh, okay.
That I formed Diamond UK.
Diamond UK.
Now, what about Pacific Distribution? I had that as a little bit earlier than that.
Okay, Pacific I never bought. Pacific Bud Plant did a deal with, as memory serves me correct. But Bill Shanis, who owned Pacific, not only comics, but Pacific Distribution, and Shanis, he had a bunch of companies, and retail too for the time. When he was out of the distribution and the publishing, I was in San Diego, and I approached Bill because my empire was expanding, and I knew he was a really valuable player, knowledgeable, and a friend. So I gave Bill, I made a pitch to Bill, and he came to work for me and worked for me for 28 years. One of the most important.
Now, have you ever tried to go past into the European Union and other aspects, or just U.S. and then United Kingdom?
Well, we don't have a physical location in any of the countries over there. That's not something that is off the table, by the way. But typically, because speed of delivery was important, if you own an account in Spain or Germany or France, shipping you out of what the time was Sparta, but now call it Olive Branch, Mississippi, central part of the country where the printer might be, or even at Plattsburgh now, we could get the book straight to your country, and you could pick them up at the airport rather than send them to United Kingdom and then relay them, which would cost a day or so. But we've never, so effectively, the way I would define it, I'm not sure how much current on the detail as I should be, but typically I would think if I'm an account in France or Germany, Diamond would service my time-related stuff, right from the printer to you fast as possible. Whereas UK has accounts in Europe, but might be more of a back supply or a different product line that we don't have. Freight becomes an issue. It's all about what the cost of freight is. It's really hard for me to sell certain things in other countries where freight is so expensive, it makes no logical sense for them to buy from us.
Mm-hmm.
Now, does Brexit in any way impact your UK?
Well, certainly anything that affects the exchange rate with the pound has been of a concern, because we have to monitor that. Our pricing in Europe, or in the UK particularly, is tied because there's the physical cover price on the book is different. They're buying U.S. comics that say U.S. prices. Right. So they have to extrapolate the British version of it. And as a result, the pound, as it fluctuates, so sometimes it's in our favor and sometimes it's in the retailer's favor. We try not to change it on a minute-by-minute basis, because sometimes we benefit for a little extended period on it in our favor, and then other times we take the hit for a period of time. It kind of comes out in the wash. And it's only when something like Brexit comes along where you see a significant movement in the pound and exchange rate for sterling that you might have to change the pricing a little more frequently or than you would have otherwise done.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, Alex?
Okay. So now, so 1994, you bought some selected assets also in a New York-based distributor, Comics Unlimited Ltd. Is that right?
That was my dear friend Walter Wang and his partner Ron Foreman. Still dear friends to this day. Comics Unlimited Limited. I always like to take the hit for a period of time. It kind of comes out in the wash.
Oh,
and
that's
it's
strange.
only when something like Brexit comes along.
Yeah, same here. Do we know why that is?
Movement in the pound.
Hold on a second. I think it was.
Yeah.
That you might have
Maybe turn that. You might want to.
No, my phone came on and suddenly started talking to us.
Recording it.
Yeah.
All right, very nice.
At least I got to hear myself.
I think somebody sent me the YouTube video saying, "Hey, look at this," and so that's what happened.
That's what happened. You clicked on it. All right.
1994 was Comics Unlimited.
Mm-hmm.
Limited, love that. And
Comics Unlimited Limited, right? And you had 27 warehouses in the U.S., Canada, and but did you have warehouses in the U.K. also?
Yeah, because that's after 93. 93,
That's
I
after
was already
93
in
and
the UK.
acquiring the other one.
I
And
think
then
I would say 28. People tell me it was 30. 28's in my head, but it could have been 30. I don't remember.
Okay. And then you had your own trucking line. You controlled 45% of the market. So were you distributing into New York before you bought?
Yeah, I had bought another smaller distributor called Crown Distribution from a guy named Gary Arkin and Mark Magladino. So those two guys, we bought that. So we had a presence in New York already.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then that just completed New York, essentially.
And Walter and Ronnie, Comics Unlimited Limited, were like the friendliest competitors you could ever have. In fact, when I first went direct to Marvel, I didn't have a direct DC account.
Yeah.
And Walter would sell me my DCs at his cost as a direct distributor. And I would get other products from another vendor and sell to Walter. It was the hardest thing. We had to do this reconciliation. He owed me this, I owed me that. And it was so much work for no money because no one had a profit margin built in back and forth. So, but I remember when I used to do it personally, and then I finally had to train somebody to do it. And I can tell you that was a tough job to do that.
Oh, okay. Now, in 1995, this is kind of is an interesting year. This is as interesting as 1987 was, is that Marvel, they're trying, Ronald Perlman is basically running Marvel, the Revlon people, essentially.
Right.
That's what Herb Trimp would call them, the Revlon guys. And they wanted to distribute their own comics. So there's a big industry shakeup, and they bought Heroes World to distribute their own titles in-house. And suddenly, and it just seemed like they weren't really equipped to do that to begin with. And it was a bit of a blunder, but they were buying all sorts of stuff at that time anyway. And at this point, this is interesting. There's a race now on who can outbid, Diamond versus Capital, as far as the accounts of DC, Dark Horse, Image, and you won that bidding because that also included a claim. What was going on? How did you outbid Capital? Like, what's involved in that?
Here's what happened. All right, when I'll try not to truncate this because I don't want to dominate or monopolize, but when you ask me these questions, they got stories.
Yeah.
So if it's okay. When Terry Stewart was president of Marvel at the time, McAndrews Ford was the arm of Ronald Perlman's empire, who also owned Revlon, as you mentioned, Coleman Equipment, probably the biggest camping equipment company. Ronald Perlman's a billionaire. He owned a lot. And he had taken Marvel, bought it from New World for, I think, $82 million. And at the time, we all thought that was crazy because they had bought it for $48 million. And the joke was he probably bought it for his son. It's play money. So he bought it. But the industry was really skyrocketing volume-wise up until 93.
Yeah.
So when he bought it, he took it public, and he actually got Marvel, I believe, at one point to a $3.5 billion market cap. But it was one of those things with the folly of as I call it, the folly of the stock market, is that it's really hard to sustain the kind of growth that they had because a lot of it was inflated. By that I mean they were doing holographic covers. The pricing on the books the elasticity had been stretched as far as you could go. The baseball card guys had infiltrated our market and had people buying cases of comic books like they did cards until they proved that was the same folly it was in the card market. So when it got to the point where I guess he's reporting to the stock market, and we know how the stock market works, what have you done for me lately? He said, all right, well, we can't raise the prices. We can't put any more holographic covers. What do we do? Well, let's buy some of our licensees. So they bought Fleer, paid $200 and some million. They bought Skybox, $150 million. The irony of which, I think I did the math, they had over $400 million invested in that combined company. And when it was dumped, it was sold for $25 million for all of it. And that guy went out of business. Mm-hmm. But so then the last straw, this is how desperate it seemed to me, my version. Mm-hmm. Let's buy a distributor. Now you're chasing pathetic margins now. But I guess that was probably part of the rationale, not chasing the margin so much, was the idea that we'll control our own stores. And I think they really had it maybe in their mind that because remember what they did? They bought Heroes World
Yeah.
But not only did they say they were going to go exclusive with Heroes World and take 35% of everybody's volume away, other distributors, they weren't going to sell anybody else's products. And maybe somebody thought at the time, this will hurt the other publishers because it'll, the distributors will go under. They are losing 35% of the business. They won't have anybody to go, and we'll have our own.
Yeah.
Well, we all know the story how that collapsed.
Yeah.
And it's sad, and it's a sad part of it. There's a part of me, you could argue, I was the beneficiary because it led to what happened to. But Paul Levitz, who was, the head of DC, did not want to buy a distributor. But he recognized or thought maybe what they got going here, I can't take a chance. It might work, and we're going to be in a compromised position. They got a direct line to the retailers, and we don't. Mm-hmm. So he made an announcement that he was going to go exclusive with somebody. Mm. And the two logical candidates at the time were Capital and Diamond. Mm-hmm. And so we had to make our pitch, our presentation. And fortunately for us, we got selected. Yeah. So what that meant for Capital, though, they had already lost Marvel like we did. Keep in mind, we don't have Marvel either at this time. But now they've lost DC. So they've lost number 1 and 2. Then pretty much 3 through 10 didn't want to be, were worried maybe the distributor who doesn't survive or get those two, one of those two, is maybe not going to last. So a lot of them came on board. So it was a really tough time for Capital. But to their credit, as I said earlier, they went from like a $150 million company with 20 locations down to 1 location and $50 million, and hung on valiantly, as a pain in my butt for a long time. They were really great competitors. And then eventually, we worked out a deal and everybody survived and nobody got hurt. And by doing that deal, my litany was, I can't wait for them, and I said this earlier, to go out of business and hope for all the free counts because it would hurt the publisher. So what happened as a result of that is we did a deal with Capital. Milton and John got paid money. John actually worked for me for 7 years. All the vendors got paid every penny, and it was a happy ending per se. But the industry, ironically, had half size. So in 1993, when I was doing $222 million, Diamond was doing as a 44% of the market. I now have all of the market, so to speak, and I'm doing 168.
Wow.
So it gives you an idea how much the market has. And then eventually Marvel, when that didn't work, came back.
So then,
we started to grow.
Basically like Image and Acclaim and those guys basically chose you because DC ended up going with you. So they followed suit.
Well, I guess that was part of the rationale. They were not just throwing up their hands. Guys like Mike Richardson at Dark Horse and the 7 guys at Image really stepped up on our behalf. They were a big part of our success as to why we survived too, because they could have went with Capital. They could have done something else. They showed a vote of confidence in us, and I'm forever grateful what they did to help us form what we are today.
Make it happen. And then when you outbid Capital with DC with Levitz, was it basically saying we'll distribute your stuff for less expensive than they will? Is that how that works?
Wait, say who did you say with who you mentioned?
Okay, well, like so basically when DC chose you on the bidding.
Yes, sir.
And I'm thinking because you had mentioned Levitz, so were you talking to Paul
Levitz? I thought you said Lennox. I mean, what did I?
No, yeah.
Levitz. Okay.
And so basically, was the conversation between you and Levitz of okay, we'll distribute your stuff for less cost? Is that
no? That's when the nature of our relationship as a distributor publisher changed to brokerage or agency.
Okay.
Meaning that DC, remember, Marvel's now got their own ability to set the discounts to their retailers. And that's a concern for another publisher because they could, when they're selling through us, we control the pricing. So if DC is selling, if Marvel's got a distributor who's competing with me, it's pretty much level playing field. They're going to only be able to do what they know I can compete with. But if Marvel suddenly sells directly to the retailers, they can actually incentivize them to buy more Marvel comics than DC. So that led to DC controlling their pricing, which argued for an agency. So what that meant was, and it's still today, DC and Marvel, they set the prices to the retailers, and we get the same thing no matter what. Whether account gets 40% or 55% or anywhere in between, we get our agency fee. And that's where the nature for the last 25 years, for the most part, of the exclusives we have other arrangements. We have some still buy-sells with publishers. We have buy-sell and consignment. There's a variety, but the crux of the big two are all agency.
I get you. That's the deal right there. And then that essentially positions Capital to distribute Kitchen Sink and Viz Comics. And then they went bankrupt in '96. And then you
But I
bought.
don't think they really went bankrupt. I think that they, because remember, everybody got paid. They didn't go bankrupt to my knowledge. They managed to walk away with their head up and paid everybody through us. So they did okay. No bankruptcy.
There you go. So then they bought. And then you bought, or Diamond bought, selected assets of Capital in '96.
Correct.
And then in 1997, Marvel signs an exclusive agreement with Diamond to serve its specialty market retailers. And they got their own set as part of that deal. They got their own section in previews, or their own previews section or magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point, then, although, and Jim is going to talk a little bit more about the monopoly stuff, but the positives. You centralize your customer service program. You added an order adjustment program. Diamond also launched a toll-free comic shop locator service. So in a lot of ways, you've reduced overhead, made it possible for the industry to actually keep surviving, and made it easier for fans to find comic shops and helped retailers, right?
Right. When I mentioned this the other day on Dan's show, you and I, us, and everybody watching, we're the problem. We want the best at the cheapest. And the only way you get the best at the cheapest is volume.
Right.
That's why you have Amazon. That's why you have Walmart. Mm-hmm. So you can't complain about it if you cause it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's what kind of happened and we're not unique. I mean, every industry's experienced consolidation. You just look at it. There's less airlines. There's less everything. Trucking companies. The ID wholesalers, who, as we call them, independent wholesalers that governed the newsstand all those years in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, there used to be 400 of them, and it was very territorial, mafioso to say the least. Now there's 3. It got broken up. So volume is critical to giving the best price and the best service, because if you're buying from this distributor and Jim's buying from the distributor, and you're both across the street, but your distributor's tiny and his distributor's big, he can afford to give that retail store, your store, much more than your distributor can give you, and it makes him impossible to compete, because you can't say, well, I love my distributor, I'm just going to suffer and not have those other services.
Right.
You need to compete on the consumer level, so you have to migrate to the guy that's able to give you the bigger or better deal. I'm not displacing loyalty, but at some point, loyalty has a price that you can't afford.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense. All right, Jim.
Okay, so at some point with all of these advancements that you're making in terms of bringing different companies together and solidifying your market share, the U.S. Justice Department reached out to you, correct? Yes. And there was some concerns about antitrust violations?
Yeah, what happened was the misnomer is they did not investigate Diamond Comic Distributors. They investigated the comic book industry. And it was at some instigation, quite frankly. Some retailers weren't happy and, called them up and said, we only got one choice, blah, blah, blah. But when they investigated the, quote, industry to see how this evolved into what it was, they declared that we were, in fact, a de facto monopoly. But because we were not a monopoly in the book business and all these other things, and that we didn't do anything that was detrimental to the industry, in fact, they could see the logic behind where the industry somewhat benefited, if not the least of which survived because of it, that was a unique thing. I mean, it's almost, maybe you could compare it to I don't want to compare it to this because it's very controversial, but, in baseball, you have the antitrust exemption. We didn't have quite an exemption, but we were considered good for the industry.
Oh, that's interesting.
We've been very careful to never cross any lines that would ever give the Justice Department pause for thinking they made a mistake, and we've never heard from them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do political parties and who's in office impact this, or did it not make any difference whether it was Democrat or Republican?
I don't even remember who was there. Clinton probably was the president at the time. That was 90s, so it was he was 92 to 2000, right? If I'm not got that right in my head. So no, I don't think it made a difference. I don't think it was even on anybody's radar.
And then the other aspect of this in film, the old studio system got in trouble because it was handling exhibition, production, and distribution, all 3, and there was some concerns about that aspect of it.
From an antitrust standpoint, you mean?
Yeah. Now, with Diamond, you had been in retail, so in terms of exhibition and distribution, obviously, but you hadn't done production. You weren't producing comics. but at some point, you did buy Gemstone, and you've over the years had a few different publishing projects. Can we talk about that?
Sure.
And was there a concern that that was going to cause any kind of a problem?
No, that never actually came up as from a Justice Department standpoint. In fact, in 1995, I did a deal with Bob Overstreet to buy the Overstreet comic book price guide.
Yes.
And really, it was a much bigger deal. I was buying the price guide, but I was also buying his collection, which was fabulous.
Oh.
So, ironically, when number 50 comes out, I'll have owned it for as many years as Bob did.
Oh, that's cool.
It was 25 each, so it's kind of an interesting time to look at it. But when I did that, I created the name Gemstone for publishing purposes. So that and then years later, when I got the exclusive deal with DC, there were some restrictions on my contract for publishing. But because I had already been publishing the price guide and things like that, Paul had put in the contract kind of a restriction on reprint things. Archival is the right word I'm looking for.
Right.
So that I wasn't going to go out and publish brand new superheroes. In fact, the definition, if I recall, said could not publish any non-fictional heroes. And the only thing I could think about, and I got to thinking about it closely, what that really probably meant was I was publishing the Disney comics. I think I was actually publishing them already when this deal went down. So as a result, Paul was, to get us as the distributor, he knew he wasn't going to ask me to close it down, whatever. So to kind of carve it out for me, created that, category. But the thing I thought about, this is going to be a ridiculous analogy. Suppose one day Paul gets a call from Alex Ross, who's drawing Batman. He said, "I'm sorry, Paul, I can't get the books in on time. I'm working on Donald Duck."
Mm-hmm.
There was a creative aspect to this that might have been be protective. I've always had to talk to Paul about that. But theoretically, that was probably more of a concern than me selling these reprint titles that have already been very small numbers. But I was doing it because I love them. I didn't want to see EC comics go away. I didn't want to see Disney comics go away. And it was kind of a labor of love. It clearly wasn't profitable, but I loved it. And it was great, ego-wise, to have my name on the Disney comics inside.
Yeah, that's cool.
And you're still publishing the Russ Cochran, the EC comics.
No, I am not. No, that license expired. Russ Cochran recently passed away, sad to say. And I think, different people have had over the years different aspects of resurrecting, whether it be Panic Graphics or whether, be IDW. Somebody's along the line that license has survived different versions. The first time they were reprinted, really, actually, was going back to Russ's son-in-law, Bruce Hershenson, who did East Coast Comics, and they did reprints of EC Comics. Then later, Hamilton and Bruce Hamilton and Russ, under the auspices of Gladstone, which was their imprint for Disney Comics, also did a version of the ECs. And then Russ did the big libraries in black and white, these large.
Those are great.
And then when I did a deal when I bought Russ Cochran out, which is another thing that formed what I called then Gemstone, Missouri, we picked up and published not only the 32-page comics, but we went on to do the prestige format or the albums and various other publications.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those
my
are
publishing
beautiful
career
books.
In comics has been the price guides, and there's been a variety of price guides, not just the Overstreet. There's Hakes, and there's a bunch of other guidebooks. But the Disney comics for a period of time, and the ECs for a period of time. But that's been kind of pretty much the extent of my publishing in the comic industry. I do own Baltimore Magazine. That's another publishing thing, but none related to the comic industry.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want to do another bringing up to current status. There have been changes where I won't say your dominance, but DC is talking about not going exclusive, or they've gone non-exclusive now. Mm-hmm. And there's other companies that are starting to talk about or trying to make a bid for some of the market share. Are these new challenges for Diamond, and how does any of this impact your situation?
Well, about 4 weeks ago, when the pandemic really started to affect everything, we shut down. I got a call from Jim Lee. He said, "Steve, it's not going to be a good call for Diamond." And he was letting me know within their rights, because in our last contract, they had negotiated a 60-day out clause for the exclusivity. And they were going to exercise that because at the time, I think they felt like, for the first time, we're in a situation where we've had to worry if one guy shuts down, what happens to everybody else? And this is kind of a unique situation, we all know, because everybody's kind of shut down. But nonetheless, they did that. And what I didn't expect was that it would be existing customers, but that being the case, that was their prerogative. And so they chose two of my really great customers, DCBS, which is a mail order company that we sell everything else to for all intents and purposes, and also one of our biggest accounts in New York, Midtown Comics, another excellent company that also has a mail order business. So that now means that Diamond is no longer the quote-unquote exclusive distributor to the direct sales, non-returnable comic book market. And I said it earlier, I have never been afraid of competition. I'm in a unique position because these guys are my customers, and yeah. I'm not going to say anything bad or do anything harmful to customers. They're great guys, and whatever their future plans are, I don't know right now. I'm sure everybody knows where this is going to shake out because the pandemic has turned the world upside down. But I do think that DC wanted to have a multiple distributor platform. It's ironic. It was brought out. I didn't even notice it. That it was almost 25 years to the very day it was brought out recently from we signed the exclusive to when the exclusive was broken. But I basically see it as this, as I said earlier. If through those two distributors or if somebody else somehow grows the market exponentially and we have less of a market share, I'm pretty confident with the size of our market share, we might do better. So I'm all about growing the market. When I first got into this, there was 20 distributors, and I had like 3% of the market. I could say, well, let's go after market share. There's 97% to get. And when I had 10, there was 90, and 20, there was 80. It was still always a market share because I always felt like if I got market share while the industry was small, it would inure to me when the industry got big. It would be harder to get when it was big. So you get to the part where we had dominant market share. Well, what's the next thing you do? Not that we didn't try to do it all along as well, but the next thing you do is try to grow the market. Right. So whether digital does that, comics being done in Walmart now that we're not carrying, whatever it is, if it grows the market, I've got great confidence that we're in a good position to get our share. And I'm not greedy. If we get our share and we can still, it all boils down to dollars. If we do $500 million as 100% of the market, to make a crazy analogy, and we did 1% of a $10 trillion market, give me the 1%. Yeah. It's right, dollars sure. At the end of the day. But I do enjoy having the big market share for the reasons other than the money too, because I feel like I have more of a influence to remind people how this started, maybe not being self-serving, to look to me as somebody who was there from the beginning and still loves it. And you should still love it. And this will make us all be more united. Whereas when there's a lot of distributors, one of the advantages the publishers got out of one, when they would do a marketing program with 20 distributors, it's really hard to get 20 guys to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. Whereas if they say to Diamond do it, the whole world gets the same message. Yeah. And that's why we have things like the comic shop locator service and free comic book day. All these things are a byproduct of being able to have one source.
Mm-hmm. So now we're in the year 2000 now. So not declared a monopoly. Everything was okay. Continuing to the new decade. In 2000, you acquire Alliance Game Distributors as well. You're distributing board games, collectible card games, etc. And that eventually became a major operating division of Diamond. So is that within the same corporate? Is it under Diamond Comics, or is that a different company?
The way we're structured behind the scenes, so to speak, and we do our financial statements as a corporate holding, that really means that the bottom line consolidated, we do obviously separate financial statement, but the consolidated picture includes Diamond Comic Distributors, Diamond Book Distributors, which is our arm for the book market, right. Diamond UK, and Alliance. Mm-hmm. I have a bunch of other companies, Diamond Select Toys, Hicks Americana, Gemstone, that are not under that financial statement umbrella. But Alliance is definitely part of that.
It is part of that. And so then in 2001, through Alliance, certain assets of West Coast distributors, Berkeley Distributors, Barchetta Distribution are acquired. And online reordering becomes available on the retail services site. Did that affect online reordering of comics as well? Did you bring some of that
Let me back you up just a second,
sure.
Just to correct that a little bit.
Okay.
The origin of Alliance was a company in Baltimore called the Armory.
Oh, okay.
Max Lipman owned it. He had approached me to buy it, and we never could come to a deal. Later on, he sold it to Dan Hirsch and Charlie Tyson, two of my incredibly great employees right now that run these companies. They then bought Chessex, which I believe was on the West Coast, and where the Berkeley, I don't know where that piece comes in entirely, but it was after they formed it and renamed it Alliance that we did the acquisition. But your question again was that changed the ordering process?
Yeah, because online reordering become available on the retailer services site. Did that also, did you bring that into the comics as well, that ability?
Well, Diamond already had, I don't know what year it started, its own version of online ordering.
Uh-huh.
You know, it was all manual for the longest while. I mean, when those order forms would come in, you know, and my God, the people in order processing, they had to tabulate that, and we made them double tabulate it to get cross-footing and make sure it wasn't inaccurate. And but Alliance, from a financial standpoint, not on the consolidated statement, but as an individual company, they kind of do their own thing. I mean, I'm sure there's crossover with the technology, but they definitely have their system, and Diamond has its system. They have their own catalog. Diamond has its catalog. But behind the scenes, there's a financial merging for tax purposes.
I got you. But they're still technically doing their own different things.
Yes.
Okay, then in 2002, Diamond consolidated its book trade into Diamond Book Distributors, which you had mentioned before, marketing trade paperbacks to Barnes & Noble, Walden, Amazon, Borders. So, and like you said, that's a different entity than Diamond Comic Distributors, but they're within the same financial umbrella. Yes. So that was one of the questions I was going to ask, which you mentioned it. And then, so then that's distributing books, let's say for Barnes & Noble, or let's say Amazon. How does Diamond Books Distributors distribute, trade paperbacks for Amazon? How does that work?
Well, keep in mind that in the case of Marvel, Hachette is their exclusive distributor to the book trade.
Yeah.
DC is Random House. So what we're selling Amazon is everything else, so to speak.
Yeah.
And their service, just like every account out of Olive Branch, Mississippi, shipments come in, they ship, and Amazon's probably no doubt our biggest account overall. Seems to be everybody's biggest account on some level.
Uh-huh.
And so as far as Diamond Book Distributors is concerned, the big difference between that and Diamond Comic Distributors, they're dealing in a returnable world.
Oh.
Because in the book market, there's a different expectation of discount. That's not to say there aren't accounts that don't buy. The definition of returnable, non-returnable, is not based on brick and mortar or geography. Okay. It's based on terms of sale.
Yeah,
I could sell a typical newsstand non-returnable if they would want it, or I could sell them. It's just the way the deal is structured. So when we say we're the exclusive distributor to Marvel and up until recently DC, basically we're saying that we have the exclusive non-returnable distribution rights to this type of store.
Yes.
So a store could conceivably be of a different physical description, but by definition it would be a non-returnable direct market store.
Mm-hmm. All right, Jim, go for it.
So Steve, one of the section I'm talking about now, my notes has giving back to the community. And you started to talk about that when you were talking about Free Comic Book Day and things like that. I want to go through some of the things that Diamond has done. In 2000, Diamond started the Diamond Bookshelf program for librarians and educators.
That's true.
What was that exactly?
Well, some of this stems from other experimental programs that I had. We felt the libraries first are a viable market that not only would be volume for Diamond to hopefully get, because they buy a lot of stuff, but also from a mass marketing approach. If people, it goes back to my argument before, how we get the growth we wanted. So if people discover comic books in a library, hallelujah, but there's got to be comics in the library for them to have it. So historically, there still are many distributors who sell exclusively to libraries. It's a big business for Baker and Taylor up until recently. I think they were sold or whatever. Somebody purchased it. So the library aspect of it was a small part of our business, but one that we were trying to nurture and grow. So we felt the approach to them is a little bit different than the typical comic book store who has to have a previews and knows what his customer wants. So we tried to give them recommendations, if you will. Because if you're a librarian, you may be concerned. You don't read the comics necessarily. You don't know if there's we go back to the censorship thing. You don't know what's in them, and maybe they
Sure.
don't want to put it in the children's section if it's got the birth of a, whatever. So the bookshelf thing, there's basically an attempt there, I guess, and I'm probably not going to do a good job of describing the full concept of the Diamond bookshelf, but I know that starting out, the concept was to be an aid, a retailer service, to be able to say, I want to, a librarian who loves comics, maybe it says, I want to start carrying comics in the library, or maybe one that has no idea what comics, but here's that it's a good thing to have. And they need some guidance. They need to know, like, what are the kinds of titles that are really good starting points for, us to put in our library. So we try to do things like that in that case.
And then what about in 2002? What was Diamond's role in relation to the first Free Comic Book Day?
Well, credit goes where it goes. Joe Fields from Flying Colors in California came up with the concept. I think he modeled it after a Free Ice Cream Day or something that Baskin Robbins or somebody did. And he presented it to us, and we kicked it around. And I got to give credit also, a great deal of credit to my team, because with due respect to Joe, they did a lot of the heavy lifting after the fact. Kind of like me, I get the idea and then everybody else gives me credit, but I didn't, I didn't do anything. And that's not saying Joe didn't. I'm just saying that there's a project that this involves that's kind of monumental, especially with the millions of comics that now have to be, we actually had to do it out of a separate warehouse in Olive Branch, because on that particular week, it's one hell of a job to get these comics out. But the good news is, thanks to Joe's great idea, it's become like Christmas. It's better than Christmas. I think it's better than Black Friday for retailers.
Mm-hmm.
So we're very proud of that. And even though we had to skip it this year for May, we have every intention to make sure that happens again in the fall, or whenever we're earliest opportunity that we can fully promote it, because we feel it's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. And then 2010, you launched kidcomics.com to direct young readers and the parents to kid-friendly comic shops.
Yeah, there's, historically, comic shops are so stereotyped that they themselves turn into the stereotype without realizing it. Superheroes, superheroes, superheroes. And being the guy I told you when I was a kid, I loved Archie, I loved Richie Rich, I loved Harvey, Disney. I always felt that there was a children's market that we need to cultivate. The demographics in the comic store, the kids, the buyers are probably, I don't know what's the accurate number, 14 to 40. But the under 14 or 12 or whatever the number is, they don't have the latitude because of the locations. They're not everywhere like when my mother was buying them. So they have to be taken to that store. And if mother don't even know there is one, they're not getting taken. And then they're discovering other things. But I always felt, and some stores have done better than others, particularly where they have traffic that's conducive to it, where they could set up a section that's kind of like geared for the younger reader. And hopefully they'll do like I did when I was 5. Oh my God, I love Richie Rich, I love Archie, I love Del. And what is this thing called Superman? Let me try that too. And eventually cultivate an interest, because as you get older, your interest changes. You start to get a little more mature, and maybe the language in a children's comic starts to get a little, not so attractive to you because you're now more articulate, you got a better vocabulary, and it's something, hey, how did I ever read that? But you were a kid, and that's what you read, and that's what got you interested. So that's another aspect of out marketing, where we're not making a lot of money on these kinds of things, but we feel, if any money, really, but we're trying to make it so that the retailers can see other potential growth areas. And because here's an irony of it, Disney comics used to sell in the millions, to pick on them for a minute, in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. And then we all know what happened in the 50s. And it wasn't just the Dr. Wortham book or the Senate investigation committees that killed comics. The distribution system was eroding to boot, and they already thought comics were a nuisance. So they got the perfect storm. Ironically, today in Europe, thanks to companies like Egmont, which is really a foundation, they sell Disney's almost house to house. And it's our product. It's an American product. And here we sell a handful of copies, but over there they sell them like crazy. Well, we'd like to see that be something that could be reversed. And I don't see any reason why that can't happen again. But I really think it's a model. It's clearly a byproduct of circulation. It isn't seen. It can't be bought. I always use the example. You could have a $3 comic book with a $20 bill inside. And if they can't find it, it won't sell. Not a matter what's, it's gotta be out there. And Disney Comics and a lot of comic stores today, can't blame them when they get the order form previews. They're not going to sit there and say, give me 50 of this or 75 of that, because they're pretty certain they're going to get stuck with the vast majority until there's a slow but sure gradual process. And there's where digital comes in. Maybe some kids who would ever not find comics when they're 5 might be on an iPad. And they look at Iron Man. Iron Man is like a second-tier character in the Marvel Universe under normal circumstances. Today he's a household word thanks to the movies. So why couldn't that happen again for Richie Rich or Donald Duck or whoever? I'm a big fan of that.
I wanted to ask you in relation to that. One of the places I've been buying some of my favorite comics in the last couple of years has been the children's book world in Los Angeles, and it's a children's bookstore. It's not a comic book store, but they have an entire section that is first, second, and it's scholastic, and it's doing things for young kids, and it's really good product. And a lot of it, as somebody who loves the form, I'm really enjoying a lot of these comics. Is Diamond looking into those kinds of things at all, or
we are always looking into every form of circulation that we can possibly find? We believe that comics, in Japan, it's like a $4 or $5 billion industry. And you could say, well, why did Japan grow to the size it did in the United States? Peaked, and then suddenly, it became a different kind of a market. Why aren't we $4 or $5 billion? Well, first of all, I think that the Asian culture is very visually oriented. Their alphabet is basically pictures. They're used to looking at pictures. And because they, in the 50s, not only did they not experience the Senate investigation things and Kefauver and whatever and Dr. Wortham, but their distribution system's probably pretty much been the solid same it was. So there was no bubble. There was no blip. It's just been a progression. And so you go on and I haven't been to Japan. I've been to Hong Kong, but I'm told if you're in Japan, everywhere you go is comic books. You're on the subway. You're wherever, the fast train, wherever you go. So they're all over the place. And what I'm told also is that the publishers actually have got it so defined that they can, we're worried about we don't have a big female audience and how do we get female comics. They've got them defined like 8 to 12-year-old boys, 9 to 13-year-old girls.
Sure.
And right up on and through to where even the businessmen are using these manga, and they keep in mind they got anime for the movies. They're very visually oriented. And it tells me that the same thing could be here, but it's a circulation issue. It's an exposure issue. And if I were telling you I had a new product and I think I could sell 5 million of something, you say, yeah, well, maybe you will, maybe you won't. But if I told you you could sell 5 million because in the past there was a time when that product did sell 5 million, you'd have a little bit better belief that it might because it actually happened at one time. Whereas something that's never happened, it's kind of speculative. You just don't know. It's take your best shot. But in the case of comics, we know at one time Uncle Scrooge sold millions of copies.
Right.
So why is it? I don't think a 5-year-old or whatever age-year-old today, with no prejudice, coming out of the womb, growing up to be 3, 4, 5 years old, is prejudiced against anything. It's a matter of what they're exposed to. So if the first thing they see is an iPad and they never get exposed to comics, it's hard for them to ever cultivate a love for comics. That's where the digital comes in. So hopefully with the advent of the digital comics, people will actually get exposed to them. And then I'm going to bank on a certain percentage of them. I'm going to say, what else you got? And where can I get more? And then on top of that, the best part about what comics bring and comic stores bring and game stores is the experience. The product is very important, but the clubhouse, to go hang out with your friends and talk about your hobby and share it, that is so unique to our business and so important. Yeah. People don't want to go to a Walmart, let's say, to buy all their wares. There may be some comics in there now, and I understand with due respect. It's great. I hope that they do well and we create some more collectors. But it's not like the atmosphere, no different than if I went to buy Diamond Select toys in Toys R Us, where it's just a mountain of everything, and it's a bad example now, right? Toys R Us. But the thought being that they want to go to a place that's their place. Yeah. They want to go where they're going to run into other collectors. If they're at one of those type of stores at Walmart, they're not expecting to run into a collector necessarily. Right. So they want so it's not just the product, it's the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's some more growth in 2008. Your Olive Branch, Mississippi Distribution Center opens with 600,000 square feet of space, high-tech warehouse management system. 2015, it expands even more, taking on 75,000 additional square feet of space, and used for reorder. What was that?
Another 100. There's 3 of them now, yeah.
Okay. And used for reorder processing, inventory storage. Then in 2016, implement a large plan of distribution, expansions, upgrades, relocating Plattsburgh, New York Center to 108,000 square foot, more than twice the size of the previous facility. Numerous enhancements, innovations to Olive Branch Center. It's exciting. It sounds like there's all this business of improving the warehouse space. So does that mean that readership is increasing with that much need of product and warehouse space, or not? What explains that?
We definitely, volume drives, need for larger facilities, better systems. And we also, when we do these things, we're always trying to anticipate. You don't want to aim for here. You want to aim for here. You got to get ahead of the game so that when you get to the next plateau that you're saying you have upside capacity to do even further levels. So you're always ahead of it. Because warehouse space, as we all know, gets eaten up in a heartbeat. It just magically, once you say there's an empty spot, somebody will find something to throw in there and fill it up. Right. So you have to get efficient. And we've tried to do that, and we still have a lot of that on the table now to, restructuring, re-examining how to be more efficient, because we have to. We haven't had an increase in fees for 25 years, so we have to keep finding ways to cut costs, but at the same time, increase service.
And then one more question. I just want to kind of go over your museum that you had for a while there, Geppi's Entertainment Museum, and there was a lot of assets there, and it was open for more than 10 years or so, and people would walk in, they'd see your collection, right? That was basically your collection.
Part of it, yes, sir.
So then, but when it closed down, you donated it to the Library of Congress, is that right?
That is correct. I'll give you a little origin here. In 1995, in the same building that Diamond was in at the time, in 1966 Green Spring Drive, Diamond pretty much had the third floor and some other floors. But the fourth floor, we had what I called Diamond International Galleries. Yeah. And it was obviously non-foot traffic. It was just a place to display my stuff and do by appointment sales and have parties and things. It was a great venue.
Oh, okay.
That lasted from 1995 to 2006 and was reincarnated into an actual museum at Camden Station by the ballpark. That lasted 12 years. And unfortunately, the west side of Baltimore, where the ballpark is, was thought to be a big Renaissance place because of the ballparks, and it never really quite yet materialized into the traffic we wanted, and plus the Oriole attendance was going down, and we were on the second floor to boot. But I hung in there valiantly for 12 years, and I got to say that thing got more accolades for a not heavily trafficked museum than you'll probably ever hear. They were winning like best museum. People came in there and said it was better than some of the biggest museums you ever heard of. Yeah. And we're very proud of that. But what it gave us, the industry, when I say us, I mean the industry, I wanted to build a place that would showcase the lifeblood of our industry, the creators. The creators in our industry, you don't go into the Louvre and see a comic book painting per se. Maybe there's been an exhibit or something, I don't know. But for the most part, some of these guys are as good or better than some of the most famous artists. And to think I could, and then on top of that, the value of these things now, it'd be kind of like going to a convention and you got your son with you and you're a wealthy guy and you want to take an interest and you want to buy some expensive stuff. And you go up to the guy's table and he's got a t-shirt on, he's got mustard stains on his shirt, and he's got a hot dog and he's chewing in your ear and he says, that'll be 20 grand. It like kind of blows the setting for value. You think you're, being taken because this can't be real. But when I opened the gallery from 1995, I wanted a place that had mahogany and marble so that when we put these valuable items in there, they would look like they were in a place that warranted it. They were beautiful. And the museum did that. So over 12 years, despite losing my shirt, keeping it open, I finally got a golden opportunity. Was almost by osmosis. They say everything happens for a reason, or that fate is a hunter. But the current librarian of Congress is a lady named Carla Hayden, who's a dear friend of mine who ran the Enoch Pratt Library for years in Baltimore. And they had just gotten the artwork. To this day, nobody other than the curator knows who donated it because they won't tell you. To the complete book of Amazing Fantasy 15 by SteveGeppi, which is I've had in my grubby little hands. I can't tell you how thrilling that is. And I went to see it. And I was with my lawyer, and we had the most fabulous friend. It was my first time to see Carla in her new job. Yeah, and it's quite an impressive place to be. And one thing leads to another. We go see. So next time she's coming to Baltimore, and she's going to go throughout the first pitch. She's a Baltimore girl now. Well, she's actually a Chicago girl, but she's known in Baltimore, having been there so many years. And she's going to throw out the first pitch at Camden Yard at the Library of Congress. So we decided to have drinks before the game. So we're talking, and next thing you know, it's one of those things, osmosis. I'm talking about, at my age, I got to start thinking about where my collection's going to go. I don't want it just to be parceled off. I want it to be preserved. Even if I give it to my kids, they can't live forever. This is something that's got to be cherished. And blah, blah, blah. Next thing you know, Carla, who's very open-minded, she starts talking about the Library of Comics, and as they say, the rest is history. So right now, they're in the process of raising a total of, I think, last I heard, $65 million for a bigger project, more than just us, where they're totally remodeling a lot of exhibits, and we're a big part of that. And we're going to have, it's kind of embarrassing to say, but it's also kind of ego gratifying. I'm going to have a room with my name on it. And it's the first time anybody's ever going to have a room with their name on it other than the dead president in perpetuity. But the real joy is that the industry not only is going to see the collection that I gave them, but because they have so much incredible stuff that's been donated to them over the years that's buried away in the archives that never sees the light of day. So there'll be rotating exhibits. There'll be traveling exhibits.
Nice.
People are going to get to see, as beautiful as my museum was, and everybody loved it, this is going to be pretty spectacular. It's going to be right as you come in the main entrance, 1.8 million visitors currently a year.
Wow.
Right there on the same floor as the Gutenberg Bible. I mean, and Carla, because she gets it, they're going to be potential for exhibits where you'll have the Gutenberg Bible, let's just say, and the first drawings of Mickey Mouse that I draw on the same peer level. You know what that does for the credibility of the culture and of the artists?
It does.
They're now being seen through the eyes of not like funny books that are worth a lot of money. No, Michelangelo, I'll buy works. That gives me great satisfaction, and I can't wait for the gala opening when we get that targeted.
Oh, that's awesome. And it's preserved. And it's a donation, right? That was a donation.
Yes. It's a donation.
So,
it's their stuff to do it as they please. But I love the fact that they'll keep it in perpetuity,
right.
and it'll be seen in perpetuity.
So I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, there's Action Comics 1 was part of that donation. So was that like kind of a reading copy and you have a nicer one?
No, you got to remember, they have a lot of their own stuff. So the beauty of this is, in some cases, it's a fill-in. You look at what they don't have and give them what they need.
Yeah.
And as a result, because remember, when you get something copyrighted to this day, you have to send 2 copies to the Library of Congress. Unfortunately, over the years, because nobody thought comics were valuable, people would steal them, slip a centerfold out of an important book to take home to put in their book that was missing one. I mean, you wouldn't believe and then, of course, they didn't know enough to preserve them right. So they have some books that are still beautiful. They've even went out and bought things, too, outright, to get that they needed or thought they should have.
Oh, cool.
So it's kind of hodgepodge. It'll be hard to define what you'll actually see. All I know is these beady little eyes saw stuff I didn't know existed when I was down to the archives. It was so awesome. Cool. They've got collections that nobody even knows they have. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just amazing how much stuff they get, and it's not all print. There's 3-dimensional things. They have a lot of stuff that people die. They will it to the Library of Congress, like I'm sure they do other places. All around the country, there's colleges that have, up in Boston University, they got Harold Gray, pretty much every Little Orphan Annie, other than the ones that got away, in the basement. And I always say, sad to say, probably in the basement, waiting for a flood or a fire to destroy it, and it never sees the light of day. Hence my argument about the Library of Congress, why they can display it.
Yeah. Jim.
Final question. So I wanted to ask
I'm on a game show.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because this is a quiz question, and this is taken from recent quotes and recent descriptions that you've given of the comics industry.
Here comes my 2 analogies. I know it's coming.
Is the comic industry most like A, the Titanic, B, an ICU, C, the last episode of Lost, D, banana cream pie, or E, all of the above?
I guess you'd have to say a little bit of all of the above. In recent Dan show, it was funny. I have a good friend, Mike Jones. He says to me, "You're the only guy could use an analogy of the ICU and the Titanic and make it positive." I actually said at the time, I don't know if this is a good analogy, but I was trying to illustrate the point of where we were, where we got people in kind of a limbo state. unopened, used to be an open. And that's kind of like somebody that knows they're not going to hospice. They're coming back out. They're going to be healthy. They're going to be good. Mm-hmm. So we got to get them there. So we take care of them until they get there, But the banana cream pie is an interesting. And it's also interesting you said Lost, because my friends who know me, and it's literally true that as I speak to you, I am in the process. I just finished season 1 of my 4th time on Lost. How crazy am I?
Really? You like it that much?
I love the show. And I know a lot of people hated the ending, but that's because they didn't watch it 3 times and understand it all. And I watch every episode with the closed captions, because if you didn't do that, unless you got bionic hearing and the perfect memory, you will miss so much that puts it together for you.
Oh, wow.
It's a great show. I love the show.
And I have a hard time remembering that these people are 15 years older now. So when I look at Evangeline Lilly, I'm saying, my God, she's 15 years older than this. I had such a crush.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. Yeah,
I do think,
but
Steve,
part of my analogies that weigh on the negative, they're not designed to do that, because as you know, I'm a super positive guy. But I will say this, that going forward, our comeback is so important that we're going to dwarf anything that we've experienced by now with positivity. And it's going to happen because everybody is going to be a part of it. It's not a one-man job. It's not a one-company job. We're getting ready to launch an initiative that you're going to read about and hear about very soon. That's going to include a lot of exciting things designed to raise money and help the retailers, because we love them. We miss them, and we want to do things for them to show them we love them and that we miss them. And they're the front lines. They're the lifeblood, and it's our job to do it. And that's going to inure to everybody, because if the retailers do better, the publishers are going to do better, et cetera, ad infinitum. So I really appreciate you guys giving me a chance to. I hope I didn't bore you too much with this history, but it's, I said the other day, there's a lot of people who came into the industry in the last 10 or 12 years, and I've kind of been like persona non grata on some level, not by design, but I haven't been out there. And this is my opportunity. I'm trying to talk to as many different categories as I can. I want to talk to retailers, large and small. I want to talk to publishers. And I mean in front of people on a show like this. I want to talk to creators. I want to talk to convention organizers. I want to talk to consumers. I want to try to infect, if I can use that word at this time, which is a terrible word to get here. I want to infect this industry and those who haven't experienced our industry yet with all the wonderful things that we all love and experience, so that they can join in, because it's not too late. We're on the ground floor to start the second generation.
Nice. Yay. And we appreciate you letting us be part of this for you.
It's a grand privilege. I can't thank you enough for letting me do this. Kudos to Bob Beerbaum for pressuring me into doing more of this. He's very much, as you know, avid, interested in the comic book history, particularly the direct market. He hopes to publish his book one day. And I hope he does, and I'm sure it'll be awesome. It'll probably be knowing Bob, it'll be about 42,000 pages, so we might have to edit him.
Last pop culture question. You have a Marlon Brando picture behind you from The Godfather. Tony Soprano, did he die in the last episode? What are your thoughts?
But you're going to believe this? You're not going to believe what I'm going to say to you. I'm as Italian as they get. FBI, full-blooded Italian.
Yes.
I have never watched The Sopranos.
Oh, man, you got to watch it.
But it's on the list. And here I'm watching Lost for the 4th time. But I will tell you this painting here.
Yeah.
There's 2 of them. There's one over here, too. They're similar, by the same artist. It's my $10,000 hot dog story. I was in San Diego going for lunch, and I went to get a hot dog. And as I walked by this thing, my eye flashed over, and I saw this painting. Being a huge Godfather fan, I've seen the movies a million times, know every line, and people in Baltimore call me the Godfather. God knows why. Maybe it's the mug. I don't know. But the same token, I go in, a guy says, how much is that? He says, $7,500. I says, can you do any better? He says, I'll let you have it for $6,500. I says, how about $5,000? I can't do it for $5,000. And I see he's got another one. I said, I'll tell you what, I'll buy them both for $10,000. Yes, done. So I went for that hot dog. It cost me $10,000, but I love these paintings.
But it feels good. Yeah,
it feels good.
All right. Well,
that's
thanks.
The theme here is The Godfather.
Well, that's awesome. Well, thanks so much, SteveGeppi, the Godfather of comics, if that's okay to call you that.
I love it. I feel it's an honor.
Oh, good. And
I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse.
And I'll try not to confuse the offer either.
Leave the gun, take the cannolis. I know.
But Jim and I had a great time here, and this has been another fun episode of the Comic Book Historians podcast. Really unique in that we don't really get to talk about this aspect, and with the godfather of this aspect of comics, the distribution and the retail. So thanks so much for joining us today.